All right, I guess we're starting. Is this my cue?
I don't know.
Welcome, everybody. My name is Kartik. I'm one of the co-founders of ETH Global, and I'm super excited to welcome all of you to the MEV Roast Scaling Ethereum edition. So I have a quick little bit of logistics to just cover before we go into our roast. And I'm super excited that all of you are here. We already have a few hundred people on our live stream and a lot of them on the Zoom chat for the discussions. And for those of you who don't know, this event is part of a Scaling Ethereum, and Scaling Ethereum is a month-long event, which is a hackathon, a handful of summits around everything that's going on with scaling on Ethereum. As part of this event, we have over 600 developers and over 1,000 people attending the various summits, and we have people from 58 different countries and 18 different time zones participating, working on a lot of cool things of what we can do with L2 systems and anything related to layer 1 on the scaling side. So we did a handful of summits over the past few weeks on just what's happening in the world of L2s, what's happening around with the merge, and how we can use zero-knowledge primitives to help with scalability. And throughout all those discussions, it became clear that there's a lot more we can cover, and that led us to sort of trying to make this work, the MEV Roast, with the theme of scaling at this event. And I'm super excited to kick that off today. So for those of you who've attended the MEV Roast in the past, this is going to be slightly different than the Zoom chats you've been able to part of. We're watching all of this on ethglobal.tv. And what's going to be different here is that anybody who has a question, we ask you to sign into the chat and ask your questions there. This is a live stream and we can see everything that you're typing, and so can all the speakers. So any questions that come up, we'll be able to relay them to our speakers and get the discussion going or get any of the questions answered. We also have the ability to get you directly onto the live call. So if you have some questions and want to ask them live, just comment on the chat directly and we'll be able to make that work. So for all of you who are joining in, be sure to say hi, and any questions that come up over the next few hours, just type them in and we'll get them to our speakers. So we have a lot of interesting topics today that we're going to cover. We're going to have our first talk by Phil, who's going to talk about just the fundamental to permissionless systems in MEV, or MEV being the fundamental aspect in permissionless systems. Then we'll have Alex talk about what MEV looks like on ETH2. And then we'll have a discussion with Phil, Justin, and Vitalik on scaling Ethereum and MEV. Then Georgios will talk about what does the MEV game theory looks like on L2 systems. And then we have a talk by Carl on just how MEV auctions looks like to the sequencer and extractions. Then we have Ellie going over MEV minimizations on L2 and just what that design constraint looks like. And lastly, we'll have another panel with Stani, Georgios, David, and Barry Whitehat on just what this world looks like for bots, users, and sequencer dynamics. So a lot of interesting themes and topics here. And for anybody who's interested in keeping up with the schedule or just seeing what else is on deck, you can just head over to scaling.ethglobal.co and see the full agenda for today's talk. And without further ado, I'd like to welcome Justin Drake from the Ethereum Foundation, who's going to be our roast master for today. And Justin will take over from here. Welcome, Justin.
Thanks, Kartik. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Flashbots, for having me. I mean, I guess just to break the ice, I've been asked as a roast master to prepare some roasty questions. So, I've taken my job seriously, I guess, and I tried to come up with the hardest questions I could come up with. And just to make it fun, I've kind of purposely used some abrasive language in the questions. So yeah, I don't usually ask questions like that unless maybe I'm in a really bad mood. So I guess we can quickly go through the questions just to give you an overview of where my mind is at, and also, I guess, food for thought for potential future discussion today. So question 1, why does the Flashbot's definition of MEV not include all extractable value, such as EVM fees? This definition is confusing and wrong. Please fix it. Question 2, can we please stop celebrating the gas savings from off-chain priority gas auctions? Those savings are absolutely minimal, less than 1% of total gas usage. And that's from the public source MEV Explorer version 0. Question 3, can we please stop propagating the misconception that the MEV power hierarchy ends with all-powerful block builders? Basically, block builders are more powerful than the bots, which are more powerful than the users. This is FUD. The real power hierarchy is users at the bottom, bots as the next level, block builders as the level above that, and then dApps and dApp designers, and then the VM, like the enshrined consensus at the very top. We primarily need to focus on better dApp designs, as well as VM level MEV minimization and extraction, such as EIP 1559. Question 4. Can Flashbot's leadership tone down the concave thinking, such as MEV is fundamental and fairness is impossible? We only need good enough fairness. We don't need perfection. And we only need good enough MEV minimization. We don't need, perfect MEV minimization. Question 5. Can the centralization risks that stem from the Flashbot's block proposer whitelisting in the context of ETH2 be properly acknowledged and taken more seriously? Question 6. Flashbot's REV, so that's realized extractable value, only provides a shockingly small 5.2% increase in miner revenue. Do you find these small REV numbers compelling enough to justify the huge Flashbot's effort? And then the final question, can flashbots.net be friendlier to non-devs and not redirect to a GitHub repo? So I guess that's all my questions, and I'll now pass it on to Tina. Oh, so it looks like Tina is not here. So
I am here. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you, our Roastmaster, for starting out, for being the bravest Roastmaster and start out with a challenge to Flashbots. And I commend your bravery. And I would anticipate Phil, on behalf of Flashbots, at the end of your talk, MEV is fundamental to permissionless system, to be able to rapid fire style address these set of 7 questions. We can dive into them later on if we have more time, but without further ado, Phil, would you like to take over the screen share and start your talk?
Yeah, absolutely. All righty. Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? Should I start my video also? Wonderful. All righty. So, hope everyone is doing well today. Today we're going to talk about MEV and what to do about it, and provide a roadmap for how we tackle this major issue in the ETH ecosystem. So maybe let's start with a reminder of why we're here, according to me, from my perspective, and a quote from the Bitcoin white paper by Satoshi, saying the system is secure, the Bitcoin system, as long as honest nodes collectively control more CPU power than any cooperating group of attacker nodes. This simple sentence is super profound and speaks directly to what Satoshi thought the security model of Bitcoin was, honest and attacker nodes. But really, kind of this honesty model is not enough and doesn't underpin, in my opinion, the reason why we all find these systems interesting. Because in the real world, this control of CPU power is actually expressed in money, in dollars, and in resources, in economic resources. Especially as we have liquid staking and mining products, things like derivatives, things like cloud rental infrastructure, that kind of increase the ease of entering and exiting these CPU positions. The game really becomes a game of money and its incentives rather than purely CPU power. So what we're trying to do here is build systems that are economically secure, and kind of assuming honesty among a fixed set is not enough, because if it was, we would use more traditional consensus protocols like PBFT. So if we disagree on this slide, we're probably not going to agree on the rest of my presentation. But this is, from my perspective, why a lot of people in my journey and in my learnings in the cryptocurrency community are here. So taking this into account, let's take an economic view of MEV. I'm not going to intro MEV because I assume if you're watching this and you're interested in this event, you kind of know what MEV is. So MEV just being basically miner fees that they can make, or validator fees from manipulating the system. And taking an economic view of this, it becomes pretty obvious that the most profitable action for validators or for miners or whoever has access to this value is to extract the value, to extract it as selfishly and as efficiently as possible. So let's think about what this means economically. In a world where no one is extracting the value and the value is just kind of sitting there, this means that any validators that engage in this pure extraction become the most profitable validators, and they rapidly concentrate CPU power and therefore network control to themselves, corrupting the security game that Nakamoto posited in the slide before. This includes things like fueling selfish mining and 51% attacks and things like that. So to be useful, to exist in a world where economic incentives dominate and where we don't have permissioned fairness and permissioned trust assumptions, we have to be robust to the above phenomenon. We need to build systems that continue to work for users and continue to operate, even though there's this economic concentration vector, even though there's this ability for validators to concentrate power to themselves. We don't want to build a system that centralizes itself basically to these validators. So in this context, to avoid concentrating to sort of validators who are willing to engage in pure extraction at the expense of the ones who are not, we have to make sure we enter a world where if there is MEV on the table, and this is assuming that MEV exists, like in ETH today, it's not talking about systems where maybe L1 is changed or L2 is changed. We'll get to those later. But assuming that MEV exists, we have to extract MEV as efficiently as possible to avoid this concentration. And everyone in the system must extract about the proportionate amount of MEV to their hash power. That would lower the margin of validator unfairness. So if you own 1% of the hash power, you should have about 1% of the MEV profits. If you own 80%, you should get about 80%. Otherwise, if you have kind of a superlinear function rather than a linear function there, you get a direct centralization vector that kind of erodes these guarantees and harms the ability of this system to exist in this economically secured model. Not only that, but a very real economic point from the stakers and validators we've talked to. Most stakers and validators just aren't willing to leave MEV on the table. They want to be extracting this. They want to have access to this value in most cases. So this model of leaving MEV on the table, if it exists, is not realistic. And what we should instead make sure is that MEV is well distributed, proportional to the validator or network hash power. This is a joke from my blog post, basically saying that, to speak to my previous point, we're trying to build systems here that are secure by economic incentives, even in the case where we have adversaries trying to attack them. And because people's rational self-interest is so large, the systems continue working. And I think it's very foolish to think that these adversaries that we're building these systems against, especially as they increase in value and become more political, will draw the line at MEV extraction and won't use this as a vector to attack the system. So that's why I see suboptimal MEV extraction as self-defeating from an economic security point of view. Now I'm going to talk about why MEV is fundamental. And by fundamental, I mean is not going to be reduced to zero anytime soon. It's not going away. Note that this doesn't mean that we can't reduce MEV a lot. It just means that we will never take it to zero. That's what the word fundamental means here. So there's three kind of prongs, three sources of the fundamental kind of value, the fundamental vector of MEV that I'm going to talk about in this presentation. And they're transcriptability, interoperability, and diverse trust models. So why is MEV fundamental? Well, the first reason is transcriptability. What we're trying to build is decentralized systems, systems where trust is distributed and decentralized and in some ways democratized. And to build these systems, what we need is auditability. Without auditability, we don't know what goes on in these systems. We could have infinite inflation. We could have double spends. As a user, we need some way to audit our finances. We need some way to audit what other people are doing in the system. And we need some way to audit the system stability, ideally through cryptographic transcripts and through cryptographic audit logs. That's essentially what we're building with these blockchain data structures. Unfortunately, when you have these cryptographic transcripts that can be validated without additional trust assumptions, you also introduce bribability. So that's something I cover in this blog post here from 2018 that talks about bribery infrastructure for vote buying and for other economic mechanisms. But basically, if you can generate these cryptographic transcripts, you can condition payments on these cryptographic actions that introduce basically this trustless bribe vector because of the existence of the cryptocurrency itself on which these actions are occurring. So we want this decentralization. We want this auditability. So we have to build systems that deal with this bribery. We have to build systems that exist in spite of it. And in fact, that was a big part of the EF's research agenda several years ago, and I imagine continues to this day, is how do we even define this model economically and what it means to be secure against bribery. So that's very much ongoing work, but we do know we want this. We want to be secure against bribery. Now, because you have multiple outcomes and you have this bribability, that is fundamentally a source of MEV, because these different outcomes have different values to different people in the network. One outcome might be worth $5 to me, where my transaction gets mined first, and another outcome might be worth $0 to me, and same for everyone else in the network. So this distribution of value across outcomes, combined with this bribability, directly provides MEV into the system. Another reason why MEV is fundamental is interoperability. So even if we eliminate MEV within a single blockchain and within a single trust model, or within a single L2, or whatever it may be, there are other sources of MEV that come from the ability to arbitrage sources of information flowing across different trust models. So things like events on Cosmos, events on Bitcoin, changes in Bitcoin transaction flow, changes in prices on centralized exchanges. These are all relevant sources of value that right now flow to the miners and the validators and are covered under this umbrella of what we refer to as MEV. And these payments will ultimately still be controlled by whoever controls transaction ordering, or whatever process ultimately controls transaction ordering, providing an incentive to manipulate this process. So anytime you have information flowing across trust models, which is required for any meaningful interoperability between systems, you have some composability boundary there, which entails some risk for anyone trying to arbitrage across these systems. And this risk directly drives profit, it directly drives arbitrage incentives, and it directly drives the kind of bribery we talked about in the previous slide. And even in decentralized networks, this risk is not evenly distributed, right? So some bots, some network actors are better positioned to capture this risk than others, which introduces MEV, which introduces this distinct set of bribery preferences and fuels these payoffs to validators and to system participants to control ordering. Last thing that fuels MEV is a diverse set of trust models. So you might just say, why not slap a fairness protocol on our layer 1? I've heard there are all these different protocols we can use to make layer 1 fair or make layer 2 fair. Why not just use a fair ordering protocol? Well, there's not such thing as one fair ordering protocol, and there's not such thing as one layer 2 that everyone's going to use, and there's not such thing as one blockchain that's everyone's going to use. In the real world, you have multiple different kind of execution zones and multiple different trust models, all with economic activity. So here's an example from a fairness protocol. So this is just one set of fairness protocols designed for permissionless systems with one set of trust assumptions. And you can see, depending on whether you want a leader or a leaderless protocol, whether you want a synchronous network or asynchronous network assumption, depending on what guarantees you want, and depending on which nodes you want to trust, because these protocols are parameterized by which nodes are running them and which permission set of nodes you essentially choose to run these fairness protocols. So depending on all these assumptions, you get different execution and different protocol operation. Now, assuming that many different people run these protocols and you have many protocols coexisting, arbitrage opportunities across these protocols start to come into play in the incentives of all the nodes that run these protocols, creating bribability and fueling MEV. So just the fact that nobody can agree, or we can't all agree on a single set of trust assumptions, fuels MEV. Why? Because any protocol that requires assumptions can't be a universal protocol, can't be a protocol for everyone in the universe. And fairness protocols will always require assumptions. Why? Because fairness always requires assumptions. Fairness is a political concept. Fairness is an economic concept. There's not a single notion and a single definition of fairness. Different users and different actors in the network have different definitions and different ideas of what's fair. Different markets require different protections against different styles of unfairness. So I don't think we'll ever have a single fairness protocol, the same way we don't have a single universal fair governance system in the real world, or a single property ledger that everyone agrees on, or et cetera, et cetera. It just doesn't exist. There's no such thing as that single source of fairness. So fairness protocols themselves, by existing in these multiple zones, themselves will also create MEV, and themselves will kind of require minor payments to run. So just the fact that there's no single notion of fairness in some ways inherently creates MEV. And relying on a committee honesty assumption to get past this and kind of move past this point doesn't really work. It doesn't economically scale because it breaks down once economic attacks and incentives come back into play and collapses back into trust assumptions. I call that self-defeat. So we can't just assume that we can slap a fairness protocol on and move on. We have to actually deal with this fundamental issue of MEV. Lastly, I want to say MEV is fundamental to permissionless systems for another reason. Why? Because all MEV is profit available to actors that are in a privileged position in permissionless networks. And these profits are fundamental to how these networks operate. So Uniswap, for example, provides a permissionless bribe, aka MEV. All MEV is a permissionless bribe to any arbitrage bot who brings the price back to market. That's why the network offers market prices even to illiquid pairs, because of this MEV. MakerDAO offers an MEV-based bribe to any bot that maintains stability of the system by liquidating vulnerable positions. Without MEV, MakerDAO wouldn't be stable, or it would have to rely on a permission set, such as, KeeperDAO or some other protocol that has a more permissioned, elected in advance set of bots. The fact that anyone can come in at any time and restore the system stability is what gives miners the ability to extract this profit, is what creates this MEV in this analysis. So same with these other systems, and permissionless bribes kind of inherently run these systems for users and create MEV. So many times we want to design with MEV, and not because we're all foolish and not because we're all bot operators. That being said, I want to address some misconceptions that might come up in this presentation. So I'm not saying that we can't reduce MEV. I'm not saying that a lot of the forms of predatory MEV that exist in the network, like Uniswap sandwiching, can't be reduced or can't be made more in line with user and protocol incentives. And I'm sure we can do this at the dApp layer, and I'm sure we can do this also at the layer 2 and layer 1 level. And I'm sure we're going to hear all about all these things in the rest of the roast. I'm not saying that MEV should not be minimized. So if you're a user, you shouldn't use protocols that have a lot of harmful MEV. You should only use protocols that expose MEV that's necessary to their operation. I'm also not saying MEV is a virtue. It's not a moral issue or a moral virtue to extract MEV. And I'm not saying today's system is the best. I call it the least unfair. Today's system is probably unfair more than it needs to be, and we can reduce that in a lot of ways with smart dApp design. I am saying we need to think carefully about MEV. We need to blame dApps, and we need to beware people who are trying to sell silver bullet solutions, saying this one protocol, whatever the protocol might be, will eliminate MEV for all use cases. It may eliminate MEV for many use cases, and it's something we should think carefully about. But we also need to still deal with this issue because it's still going to exist in the cryptocurrency world no matter what we do. And this is something I'm happy to debate on, and I'm sure we'll debate kind of people on the panel later. If you want to read more, you're welcome to read kind of the expanded form of these arguments on my blog. It's linked here. Highly encourage that. And lastly, I think I'm out of time, so I will leave you with this slide, which is summarized in my blog post and says what I need to do. Sadly, I don't have time to answer Justin's great questions, but I'm sure we can make some time for that and also hit them in the panel that Justin and Vitalik and I are on later. Cool. Thanks, everyone. Hope you found that interesting. Happy to hand it back to the roast master, take questions, whatever the relevant order is. I will open the chat now.
Do we have any questions for Phil? I mean, I kind of have one question, which is, one of my questions there, which is, you say that MEV is not fundamental in the sense that we can't get it to zero, but who cares about zero, right? What about 1%? If we remove 99%, 1% is negligible and we can just forget about it. And I think my intuition is that every technique basically might remove half of the remaining MEV. So for example, EIP 1559, that might extract and burn half the MEV, and then you're left with the other half. And then you might have another technique like, I don't know, VDFs or whatever. And then you have all the other techniques, and then they gradually chip away. And because you have this this distribution, basically, as soon as you have 5 techniques, you've removed the bulk of the MEV. And so even though I agree it's true that MEV is fundamental, it's a bit defeatist in the sense that we should really be focusing on the solutions that will chip away at the MEV.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. Like the reason I started researching MEV is because I think it is a potential fairness issue for everyone who uses cryptocurrencies. Whether or not you use systems with MEV, other people's MEV also affects your system. So that's an important point to make. So I think it is important to reduce it as much as possible. That being said, I've written personally many libraries, many papers on MEV techniques, and thought about this quite a lot. My personal opinion, and I'm happy to debate this, and maybe I think I do want to debate this on the panel that we're on, is that all of these solutions have some UX trade-offs. And one example is batching, right? Or delay-based solutions like VDF-based solutions. All these solutions have UX trade-offs for users. And the question is what do people prefer? Are there still going to be people who want to use this real-time exchange? And are there people who are going to prefer to use this kind of delayed exchange?
So what's the trade-off of EIP 1559? What's the UX trade-off? If anything, it's a UX benefit.
I don't think EIP 1559 affects MEV. It introduces a static base cost for transactions, but ordering can still be done completely out of band if necessary.
Well, that's because you have the wrong definition of MEV. That goes back to my question 1, which is MEV should include all extractable value, which currently includes the fees. And MEV is bad for many reasons. For example, it leads to chain instability, and so EIP 1559 does definitely reduce MEV by not giving it to the block proposers.
So I think the transaction fees people are paying for inclusion are actually a very small percentage of the eventual MEV market. Even today in many blocks, in a substantial percentage of blocks, several percentage of blocks, they're negligible compared to other MEV sources, which makes them already negligible in the consensus game. Whether or not they're always negligible, if they're often enough negligible, which they are, they're what we should be designing for, in my opinion. And so those fees are not spoken to by 1559. So you're right, it does change the dynamics a little bit in that some of the transaction fees are burned, but it's plausible that miners or transaction fees could increase to accommodate for that. And if not, it's plausible that there could be other out-of-band games. So I do think, yes, it specifically for kind of congestion fees and chain stability, it starts to chip away at that issue, but there's still the game is still fundamentally unchanged, and the deeper protocol level mitigations are still things that we haven't explored yet. And I would love to discuss those too. And I think there's a lot of stuff we can discuss there. But my kind of journey on this is that I spent a long time with a lot of projects I advised, DEX protocols, other smart contract projects, things like that, trying to get people to address MEV, trying to get dApps to address MEV. And the main pushback was the UX trade-offs. Their users didn't want it, except as an option. And once you introduce it as an option and you have liquidity that's split across these different MEV solutions, that actually ends up creating more MEV, which is kind of what the analyses showed. So that's kind of why I'm coming at it from that perspective. I don't think there's nothing to be done there. I do think there's something to be done, but I think that I've personally run into this brick wall of UX trade-offs often enough that I'm not trying to be defeatist. I'm just a little bit defeated. And I encourage people to keep coming up and keep kind of chiseling away at this, because I think it is super important and it's very under researched. And like having more people on it, I think reduces the probability of defeat there.
Phil, what do you think about the engineering arms race of MEV? Because MEV doesn't have like zero cost to extract. Like someone has to build the analysis systems to do MEV extraction. And I think like one of the patterns that I see is like the perception of extractable value has to reach some sort of critical mass before the engineering starts to happen. Like there was like some amount of extractable value on it threshold that Ethereum reached before MEV extraction like became serious. And I would observe for years like that, like oh, there's MEV here, but no one is abstracting it. It's because like writing that code was not trivial.
Yeah, I agree. And part of the reason we started Flashbots is that we saw that equilibrium sort of shifting in the run up to this current bull market. And I think like anyway, this current DeFi boom and this current ETH bull market combined with the rise of so many different DeFi protocols on ETH have made MEV on ETH just like too big to ignore. And I think there are several different projects that are out there, at least a dozen that I know of, that are actively, working towards building that infrastructure. So I think that is true for a while. But I think especially for ETH today, practically speaking, the size of the market just grew so large, and the design is what it is. Like we can talk about changing it, and I think that's a conversation we can have. But like in practice, it just did grow to like a multi-billion dollar DeFi market very quickly, without having designs that were ready to compensate for the changes in MEV. So in that situation, like the infrastructure cost becomes really much lower, especially when you have like desperate miners who are looking at things like proof of stake. So yeah, I do agree with you. At the same time, I think that cost was starting to be paid by many entities. And so the most important thing to do at that point is to try to democratize things as much as possible in the short term and try to advocate for reduction and for dealing with this as a commons issue in the medium term.
I think this relates, and like the connection I wanted to draw to like this like portfolio of mitigations is like we deploy these portfolios of mitigations, we work on these portfolio of mitigations, they have UX trade-offs. And then we don't ever know whether or not you've actually mitigated enough. It's like any kind of security mitigation. Like you don't know if your mitigations are good enough, because as soon as one leak becomes valuable enough, then like engineering resources will get focused on like extracting as much value from that. And that's another aspect of it, which I like sort of relates to like the fundamentalness of MEV is like we can keep working on mitigations and we are like morally obligated to work on mitigations, but like the mitigation, like we will never know if you've mitigated it enough.
Yeah, I think we can only like observe kind of the second order impacts of mitigations and like keep introspecting, and it has to be a continuous process, because this is like essentially what we are rebuilding and we will rebuild is like the general financial arbitrage game that was built in like the 90s on Wall Street, which I think we want to avoid a lot of the pathologies of. But I think there are real parallels here where, I see mitigations as like kind of exchange design and fairness proposals in that world that try to increase fairness by doing things like batching to try to reduce profit for HFT. And I think a lot of the analyses that people have there on fairness kind of apply to MEV also. You can port them into this world. For example, batch auctions, like you can analyze them to be more fair than limit order books. At the same time, there's very little data on how fair they are when they coexist with limit order books and like what arbitrage across them looks like. The same way, like fairness protocols, you can analyze them to be fair in isolation. It's much harder to analyze what they'll do in the real world, or what they'll do when they're running for a while, or as incentives change, as people get corrupted, as they get attacked, things like that. So that's kind of, I think, the work that really needs to be done. And it's like multiple decades of research that need to go into that.
With that note, I would love to invite our next speaker, to present MEV on ETH2. Alex, please go ahead and share screen. And we will revisit a lot of the questions in the side chat and from the ETH Global TV at the panel after Alex talk.
Hello. Can you guys see my screen?
Yes.
Sweet. Sweet. All right. One sec. Put a little timer on. All righty. Let's get started. Thank you, Phil, for the great presentation. Phil kind of talked about permissionless systems in general, and I'm going to talk about MEV in ETH2. And hi, I'm Alex, part of Flashbots. All right, so a quick recap, first of all, about the merge and ETH2 in general. So in December 2020, the Beacon chain was launched, and it's essentially this separate chain that runs on the proof of stake consensus already, where you have validators voting on Beacon blocks, and these validators submit their ETH on an ETH1 smart contract deposit and then become validators. And so what essentially going to happen at the merge is the shift for Ethereum from a proof of work consensus mechanism to a proof of stake consensus mechanism. And you could compare it to like a mid-air engine change, flight engine change. It's not as dangerous as it sounds, just because the Beacon chain has already been launched and has been amassing more validators. But this is essentially like a way that I found useful to think about it. So essentially changing the consensus engine of Ethereum. But so if you've kind of followed that analogy, we have this kind of dual chain model, right? So we have this consensus chain that has already been existing, the Beacon chain, and we have the existing Ethereum chain. So what's going to happen after the merge and when Ethereum is now on a proof of stake consensus mechanism is the Ethereum blocks as we know them today, and so I've called them ETH1 blocks, are going to be included in the Beacon chain as an element of a Beacon block alongside consensus objects such as validator attestations, exits, and deposits of validators. And there's a slight difference in proof of stake where the validator is known, a validator is chosen in advance to propose a particular Beacon block. And so that's a slight change that we're going to talk about that's important. And so if we go through the standard Ethereum transaction execution before and after the merge. Before the merge, a user would send a transaction. The transaction is propagated on the ETH1 P2P layer. Transaction shows up in an ETH1 client mempool. A client would be a node software that a miner would run, for example, with some transaction ordering interface and mining interface. An ETH1 client would form a block, then the block would be added to the ETH1 chain should the miner win the proof of work lottery. And then what's not mentioned here is, I guess, as other blocks are built on top of that one, there's probabilistic finality that's reached. After the merge, a user would still send a transaction. The transaction would still be propagated on the same peer-to-peer network layer. The transaction would still show up in ETH1 client mempools. The ETH1 client would still form the blocks. The same software that currently assembles block in Ethereum would still do that after the merge, and so in ETH2. The only difference is that the block is now passed to the ETH2 client, as we showed in the previous slide, right? As an element of a Beacon block. And then the finality is slightly different. It's probabilistic at first and then deterministic after some amount of time, and when an amount of Beacon blocks have passed and have been finalized. And so let's focus on this bit first. So this is interesting because this doesn't change that much. And so I think when people think about ETH2, they think about a radical change in transactions and that type of stuff. And that's actually not really the case. And so more than this, we see that the same software is used to order Ethereum transactions. And that's key because we can kind of first takeaway that Ethereum transaction ordering as we know it today still exists in ETH2. That's important for the extracted MEV that we know of. So the value with respect to transaction ordering, from, for example, arbitrages and liquidations, the game of ordering transactions would still happen very similarly. And by, as we know it today, I mean the same P2P layer and the same software that orders transactions, as I was mentioning. And so now that we know this, we can kind of reason about, hey, what if validators would run transaction ordering software that looks like a Flashbot's MEV Geth, right? And so a slightly modified ETH1 client that is able to accept tips from users for transaction priority. And we can use some of the numbers of Flashbots to reason about this and to kind of map out validator rewards. And that's something that we presented in the previous talk, and we're going to build on a little bit now, the previous talk given last week. So we're using a Pintail's model. Pintail is a great article on this that I've put the link here, and I'll share more. But so thank you, Pintail, and we're using his Python code and building on it. So the assumptions, as I kind of showed in the previous slide, is about 0.18 ETH per block of MEV, and that's from Flashbot's numbers, and so that's actual value that we've seen flow. And then 52% of blocks that have MEV in them, and so not all blocks have MEV. And then extra limitations around there's no TX fees added, which goes back a little bit to Justin's point around the definition of MEV, and other things to mention. I guess one key thing is the 0.18 ETH is definitely a lower bound, and there's going to be an update to our infrastructure very soon that would change that number. So take the numbers that I talk about as more a way to build intuition around this, and maybe to start talking about the implications of MEV rather than exact figures to build on top of. So mapping out the MEV enhanced validator yields, this is a graph that we showed last week with Tomas. The orange curve is MEV enhanced validator yields. The blue curve are normal validator yields without MEV, and the blue dotted line here are the actual number of validators in the system currently, which is about 120,000 for 4 million ETH staked. And so we see that MEV boosts revenue by about 70.9%, 70.9%, which is pretty significant, especially when you compare that to miner revenue and the boost of MEV to miner revenue, which we found to be somewhere between 5 and 7%. Again, as Justin mentioned in his questions. So this is kind of an order of magnitude higher, and it's definitely important and worth keeping in mind. And so more validator rewards means more validators because there's more, it's more attractive, and that means more security ultimately for the Ethereum network. So that's great. Yay. However, in reality, MEV is only earned by the block proposer because they're the ones who are paid this tip, and they're the ones who have the ultimate power related to transaction ordering. And over a finite time scale, there is actually a range of blocks you can hope to propose. This is just governed by like a simple binomial distribution. And so in Pintail's article, again, he or they show for 100,000 validators how many blocks can they hope to propose for the unluckiest 1%, the median, and the luckiest 1%. And you can see that there's a wide range, so 15 to 39, right? And Pintail maps that, and you can see the orange and blue curves there are for the unluckiest 1% and luckiest 1%. And you can see there's a slight difference between the two. But now if you add MEV onto that, the two curves that you see here are now collapsed here, and the difference is pretty much, you can't see it, but this is the average MEV, the unluckiest and luckiest, and you can see how wide the gap is. And that's something to think about more deeply in my opinion, because a second takeaway that maybe we can see from this is that MEV increases the variance of returns between the luckiest and unluckiest validators. And that brings up a lot of questions that we haven't answered yet, and this is something that we're thinking about more, but does it exert pressure for pooling dynamics to happen, right? Because you want to smooth out that variance of luck. Does it mean that MEV is prohibitive to being a solo validator? Or does it exert additional pressure for oligopolic dynamics to form, right? Where people that have a large validator stake will have more blocks that they propose, they will get more MEV rewards from that, and then they will have more ETH, and then they can stake more, and that kind of cycle. I'll also add that right now we're assuming an even distribution of MEV per block, that's 0.18. In reality, MEV is highly unevenly distributed, and this would exacerbate this effect. So that's the second takeaway about MEV on ETH2. Going back to this kind of flow of transaction execution, the second bit that's interesting to focus on is actually the difference, right? And so the difference in how the block of Ethereum transactions actually gets passed onto or gets validated by the consensus, or how do validators or the network comes to consensus on it. And this is where the difference is. The block proposer is different. In ETH1, the block proposer, or today, is a miner, and in ETH2, that would be a validator. And in ETH1, the miner knows probabilistically if they're going to propose the block or not, depending on their hash rate. Whereas in ETH2, the validator is selected in advance, and there's a single validator selected to propose a block at a particular slot. And so that's also different. But so thinking about what changes, consensus voting power is now governed by the amount of ETH held, and because you stake security deposits of 32 ETH, and the largest ETH holders are exchanges. And so if you look at the ETH1 deposit addresses, you can see that a large chunk, about 17%, is Kraken. There's Binance, there's Huobi here, and there are other players coming online as well. And this is interesting because these players are regulated under different regulatory regimes. They have other activities than simply staking, and they have other services as well where staking might have synergies with, and where MEV might have synergies with all of this. And so this is going to shape the MEV landscape to some extent, and what people are willing to do given the jurisdictions they're in and given the other services they offer and the reputation they have. And it's definitely worth keeping in mind as a mental model. I will say what isn't shown here is that for a lot of these large exchanges and players, they don't necessarily run validators in-house. Rather, they redirect a lot of staking flow to other pools, partly to avoid correlated slashing risk, and partly to avoid just the huge overhead of running in-house validators. And so this is not necessarily correct in the sense where it is possible, and I would have to double check that Kraken, for example, directs some of their flow to Stakefish or to Stake.us. And so this is a little bit something to keep in mind. The other thing that's interesting is you have new players coming online, not only the large ETH holders, but also these meta pools or pool aggregators in a way. So Lighter is an example of that, where they offer staking derivatives, in particular liquid ETH. So you don't have to, you're not stuck not being able to withdraw your ETH as being a validator. And they redirect staking flow to validator pools, right? And so these are the ones kind of mentioned here. And so you can think of the dynamics of these meta pools or these pool aggregators similar to these DEX aggregators in a way, right? Where when DEX aggregators came, what they end up doing is bringing the price of similar assets on different DEXs in line together and making things more efficient. And so if you kind of port that logic to profit sharing of MEV and also the MEV activity that validator pools engage in, I think these meta pools or pool aggregators, however you want to call them, are going to exert influence there and are going to be able to potentially set some social norms, but also influence in the split in MEV profit sharing. So that's also important. So the third takeaway is the identity of block proposers changes, and that's definitely important and worth considering again in your mental model of MEV. So there's a lot of things we didn't talk about. This is a short presentation, but we've been doing a lot of thinking on different fronts. The first one is this is all assuming that layer 2s are not like fully adopted, but in reality, a lot of the transaction ordering is going to move to layer 2s, right? And what's going to be living at the layer 1 are these kind of like roll of batches and fraud proofs. And so that might change some of the thinking that was mentioned in the previous slides. There's also the cross layer 2 ordering that's interesting and how that relates to, for example, sharded Ethereum and the role of centric Ethereum. And so there's been talks of staggered shard blocks, for example, and that might introduce a new sense of ordering between different L2s. There's also new constraints on MEV search. The fact that what I mentioned before, the block leader selection is known in advance is very interesting and relevant to MEV, and predictable block times as well. Fixed block times of 12 seconds is also interesting from a simulation time and optimization perspective. And also many other things. Ones that I would note is future protocol level changes and how they affect MEV, stateless clients, change in finality gadget from Casper FFG to CBC, and other things there that are fascinating to explore. So as a quick summary of the presentation, transaction ordering as we know it today still exists and still happens on ETH2 and happens with the same software, and transactions are propagated on the same peer-to-peer network layer. Our early numbers show that MEV rewards are a bigger deal in proof of stake Ethereum than in proof of work Ethereum. And so the impact that MEV would have will be accentuated. It looks like MEV rewards could help make Ethereum more secure by incentivizing a higher amount of individuals to be validators. At the same time, it looks like MEV rewards could accelerate dynamics that were explored by Phil as well, right? In the sense where if MEV is not extracted or is extracted asymmetrically by one party over than another, you might create this instability that is important to think about. And there's a change in the actors that hold consensus voting power, in particular who the block proposers are. There's a lot more research to do, and we look forward to collaborating with a lot of you and a lot of organizations on this. This is the beginning of us thinking about not only ETH2, but also how that interacts with layer 2 and roll-up centric Ethereum. So consider this as like an introduction to some of our thinking there, and definitely an invitation for you to participate, share your opinion, and contribute. And that is it. Thank you. I wonder if we have time for questions. I let maybe Justin, let me check the chat actually, but thank you for listening. And yeah.
Thank you, Alex. I'm not sure if we have time for questions. I don't see any questions in the chat.
All right.
If we do have questions, I have one, but it depends on if we have time or not.
Please.
Okay.
I would suggest let's go ahead with your question. Let's keep it short. And while we promote Eli from Starkware to present next before the panel.
Okay, great. I guess I just want to highlight question 5 from the very beginning, which is as I see it, the migration from the current design of Flashbots from ETH1 to ETH2 poses a potentially significant centralization risk. And the reason is that there's this whitelisting aspect. So it's okay to whitelist pools, it's okay to whitelist whales, but you can't whitelist 10,000, enthusiasts, mini stakers. So could you highlight this centralization risk and the efforts that are being taken to address it?
So you're totally right, and part of this centralization that you mentioned is related to preventing spam risk and DDoS attacks on miners, right? And what's interesting about ETH2 is this fact that I mentioned before, right? That leader election is done in advance. It means that you wouldn't necessarily need such a relay anymore. And we've been exploring these kind of alternative architectures there, where you could, for example, encrypt your Ethereum transaction with the key of the validator that is going to propose the beacon block for the slot that you're targeting, and then you wouldn't have the same issue. The issue that you have with proof of work right now is you don't know who's going to mine, and so you have to share these bundles with all the miners at once, and there's slightly different simulations you have to do with each of them, and so all that complexity is something that is unreasonable to ask miners to do, and so that's why we've kind of taken on that role. But it's definitely something that you're right is not. Is not something I mean, it's not necessarily sustainable, nor something that we aspire to keep in the system. So we're actively exploring it. We are also participating ETH Global's hackathon, Rayonism, where we're like prototyping quickly on what MEV would look like on ETH2. So it's definitely top of our mind. And as we've kind of outlined in our values, et cetera, right, we want to preserve Ethereum's core values, and one of them is obviously decentralization. So it's something that is close to our hearts, and it's very important to us to do.
Fantastic, thank you. Yeah, it's very interesting that this public knowledge, it can be turned into an advantage. Like traditionally, I think of it as a disadvantage.
Yeah, and I will even go as far as saying that with layer 2, and we'll hear more about them today. Leader selection is going to be a key criteria to understand how the MEV mechanics to some extent. And I think the exercise for us to think about MEV mechanics from ETH1 to ETH2 we can reproduce that pretty easily to other layer 2s, and both their finality mechanics and also their leader selection mechanics, and that might guide us in what MEV would look like in these systems. So it's definitely interesting. Is Eli here?
We're still waiting to get him on board. Just having some panelists debugging, but if there's any other questions from the chat or the comments, we can relay that for the next minute or two.
I'm reading the chat now. I don't know, Justin, if there's anything you want to
Maybe I'm looking at the wrong chat.
No, sorry, I'm looking at the Zoom chat. I need to open the ETH Global one to check.
Yeah, I'm looking at the Zoom chat. I'm not seeing any questions there.
Oh, Vasily, knowing slots in advance opens up realistic possibilities for multi-block MEV. I agree, but I also, so maybe Justin, you could talk about secret single leader election. And I understand that's like a future improvement, but then that would limit knowing the slots to, I mean, you wouldn't have a public list of who is going to be the validator for a particular slot. I'm also curious about maybe proof of custody and how that interacts with this and key delegation in general, where pools would have a lot of power over, for example, they would have several contiguous slots or this type of thing, and how realistic is that?
Yeah, so I actually don't think the secret leader election changes too much on the MEV front. And the reason is that even though the general public doesn't know who will be the validators, there's still two things. One is that you can still potentially encrypt to kind of this unknown public key. You know, it's an interesting cryptography problem to think about. And then the other thing is, you as a validator or as a pool, you still know where you are positioned, right? Even though the world doesn't, you still know. And so you'll still know if you have two contiguous slots. And yeah, I think this is a kind of a worrying, potentially worrying centralization risk, right? Because the probability that you have 2 or 3 or whatever contiguous slots is going to be, you know, a function of how large you are. And so that will incentivize larger pools. Yeah.
Interesting. I'm curious to. I've been writing a little post, and I've been trying to compute the number for the probability of having 2 contiguous slots. I'm not done yet, but I'd love for you to check it out.
Right. I mean, actually, we did quite a bit of research on these contiguous slots idea, and the reason is that it affects RANDAO, right? So in RANDAO, you're meant to reveal or not reveal a secret. And if you have several contiguous slots at the end of an epoch, then you get to manipulate the randomness. So quite a bit of analysis was done, and I think Vitalik wrote some ETH research posts that are possibly relevant to calculate probabilities there.
Got it. Thank you. I mean, what's not clear to me is if you're a validator, and by the way, if Eli is here, please. I'm just talking until he's here. What's not clear to me is how like the actual mechanics work. If I'm like a validator and I submit my stake to a validator pool, how much power do they have over? Like, do they have full control of my key? Is there something there that there's like an anti-centralization measure that's baked into the protocol right now, or that you guys are thinking about? So I was told about proof of custody, for example, and I'm not sure how that interacts with all of this, if at all.
Well, as it stands today, most pools are fully custodial. So for example, Coinbase, you know, they just hold your Ether and they'll do everything on your behalf. And in terms of incentives for, for not having this centralization risk, one of the main ones that we have is basically penalizing correlated failures. So if we have, let's say, 30% of the network, or 50% of the network that goes offline, then that's more heavily penalized than just 1% going offline for an extended period of time. Another thing is if you have one validator who gets slashed, that one validator will only lose a small amount of ETH. But if you have 30% of the network that did something like a slashable offense, then the penalties will be very large. So that's something that maybe the general public doesn't realize because it hasn't happened yet. But my prediction is that at some point in the future, one of the exchanges are going to mess up, and it's going to be extremely costly, and there's going to be a great lesson in terms of diversification, because you don't want to put all the validators in the same place.
So anecdotally, I've been talking to people who might have been looking at this for the exchanges front, and it seems they're very aware of this correlated slashing risk and are also diversifying their infrastructure so they don't have this. But what I've been thinking about is that infrastructure decentralization is not the same as power decentralization, right? Even though they decentralize the infrastructure, if they still have some say over the ordering of blocks, for example, or they have control over the ETH1 clients that are used to to include the ETH1 block in that beacon block, then even though the infrastructure is decentralized and they might not suffer from a very harsh correlated slashing risk, they might still have power over that other thing. And so I don't know if the infrastructure decentralization is a strong implication of power decentralization in terms of consensus voting power.
Right. I mean, one thing that comes to mind in this whole pool situation is one of the attacks one of the ones I'm most worried about is basically an inside job by the pools. So, we've made a lot of effort in the ETH2 design to separate the online staking key from the offline kind of withdrawal key. And my guess is that the exchanges have extremely good cold storage infrastructure, and the withdrawal key almost certainly won't get compromised, even by some sort of internal employee, like a rogue sysadmin. And so there's this kind of feeling of security where, because the sysadmins can't access this withdrawal key, they can't really steal funds. But actually, that's a false sense of security. And the reason is that there's a ransom attack that you can use if you have access to the signing keys. And the reason is that you can trustlessly hold your validators at ransom by threatening to post via slashing. Exactly. And so if you're Coinbase and you have 30% of the validators, let's say, then that's effectively maximal slashing. You'll lose 100% of your stake, and so the power that you have to perform this attack will depend on how large your pool is. So if you want to mitigate yourself against these rogue sysadmins attacks, go to a small pool.
Interesting. Thank you. I believe Eli is here. Hi, Eli.
Yeah, hi.
Are you
Hello.
able to share your presentation from your phone, or would you like someone?
I prefer that if someone else can do it for me, that would be easier, because I'm joining from actually just from some family event from a car. You don't want to hear the full story, anyways. So if someone can share my my screen.
Tina,
yeah, let me just do like this, and then I can. Okay, can you see me well?
Yes.
Okay, and can you hear me well?
Yeah.
Terrific. And I'm supposed to go for like 15 minutes or so, or 10 minutes, and then leave time for questions?
Let's aim for 10 minutes and leave for questions.
Okay, so 10 minutes. Okay, so I'll start. So hi, I'm Eli Ben-Sasson. I am a co-founder and president at Starkware. And I want to tell you a little bit about a few of the methods for doing MEV protection on layer 2. And of course, I'll be speaking from the angle of Starkware's technology. So I'll be focusing mostly on Vdoo, which is a Stark-based VDF and time lock. So can we move to the next slide, please? Okay, so what is the problem? The problem is that the L2 operators, right now we're discussing MEV protection on layer 2. So any operator that is operating on L2 receives transactions, and just like on L1, just like with the miners, this operator may extract value unfairly, and in the same kind of from censoring transactions, from inserting the operator's own transactions, and from modifying the true sequence of events. So those are the three problems, right? Deletion, insertion, and reordering. Can we move to the next slide, please? Now, how can we solve this on layer 2? And I want to say at the very beginning that actually conventional methods in certain cases may work very well, okay? But I'm not going to devote a lot of talk to that. So what do I mean? I mean, in the conventional world, like if you go to, standard regulated exchanges, they will have similar problems. And the way they are, their integrity is asserted and checked is by a combination of auditing, reputation, and legal incentives. So if you assume that there's an ability to hold the operator accountable, either by inclusive accountability, meaning that the mempool is visible to everyone, or by some delegated accountability where there's some, legislator or regulator that can look at things, then you can apply the conventional mechanisms, right? It's a repeated game. People will leave if the reputation is damaged. And of course, there's the fear of legal actions. And this applies to single operator, in particular, the systems, the customers that we are right now serving, diversified, DYDX, Immutable X, these are all single operators that they and Starkware, if we were to do shenanigans, all of these things would apply to us. So I know we're not, and I trust that our counterparties are not. And it may apply to decentralized operators, especially if the operator identity is public. Okay, so if you have a small network of public entities, reputable financial institutions or something, then this may apply. But let's move to the next slide. So let's talk about the more interesting case. What kind of cryptographic primitives can we put to bear on this? So we have commit reveal schemes. That's the first kind. You have VDFs and time locks. That's going to be my focus. You have trusted execution environments like Intel's SGX, and you have secure multi-party computation. These are 4 different methods that I'm aware of that can be applied to solve the problem, and especially in the case of decentralized operators. So let's move to the next slide. Here's a brief comparison of how they, a few parameters. So the first column, is this a non-interactive setting? Because non-interactive is a little bit better. It's more complicated when you have interactive protocols. Parties can leave off, and it makes things much more complicated and less secure. So VDFs and trusted execution environments are non-interactive. Whereas commit reveal schemes and secure MPCs, they are interactive and hence, not as good. You can ask which of these technologies is available, today for use. So all but secure MPC, I would say, are available. Secure MPC, theoretically we know how to do it. There are some things out there that are like this, but you don't have elements of this form in production today. So if you're asking about VDFs and time locks, so Starkware has a Vdoo service running right now. Everyone can use it. There are other such VDFs. Chia has a VDF. There's a whole bunch of other things. Transparency, is there a trusted setup? Do you need to trust anything? So all of these protocols, but for the trusting execution environment, they are transparent or can be made transparent depending on what is the technology you're using for the secure MPC or commit reveal or time lock. I think the lack of transparency for the trusted execution environment makes it very problematic because, I don't find it reasonable to assume that a lot of value will reside on trusted execution environments without keys being compromised. And finally, what kind of protection do you expect to get from these schemes? So I think that the bottom two give you much better protection because you can have inputs fully encrypted and the operator will sort of operate on them without even knowing exactly what's going on. Whereas with the first two, it's a bit, the information is revealed at some point or can be revealed and they are, they give you some of the protection, but not as good. Now, if you look at these, so I would argue that VDF time locks are kind of in the sweet spot as far as we know today because they have all the V's and they're, they don't have the 3 pluses. They're not fully green, but I think they're pretty good. So they may be used. Let's go on to the next slide. Now, when it comes to cryptographic time locks or VDFs, there are 2 basic mechanisms that you can use them, 2 modes you can use them in. You can use a time lock where transactions are, so you can ask users to submit their transactions using a cryptographic time lock, plus some expiration time to prevent opening of this. So that's one mechanism, right? So now when the transactions are put in the mempool and are being sequenced, the operator doesn't really know what's going on, and only after they've been sequenced are they opened. The second option is to apply a VDF, which means that the transactions are submitted in the open, so the operator actually sees them. The operator will sort them arbitrarily, but now will fix the sequence in a block, right? We're talking about L2, so you can rely on L1 for your security. So you basically commit to this order, you apply a VDF to the block header, and then you use the VDF randomness to resort and shuffle the transactions according to the permutation that was selected, and then you process them. Okay, so those are two basic options you can use with time locks. And let's just do a brief comparison of them. So let's move to the next slide. So if you look at the time lock based approach, it's slightly better in that it actually shields the information while it is being sequenced from the operator, which means that the operator, it precludes the operator from inserting or deleting certain things, right? Because the operator doesn't know what's going on. Whereas in the VDF approach, the operator can extract some value by deleting transactions, inserting her own transactions and things like that. So there's an advantage to the time lock based approach in this shielding, but on the downside, it requires K computations of delay functions, because each one of these delay things needs to be open. And I know that there are some really, really cool VDFs which can be, or time locks that can be opened with just one opening, but at least the ones that I'm aware of that are out there right now in production don't have this property. And then the challenge is that, but the challenge with the time lock based approach is that miners may demand to see the unlocked transactions given to them by side channels, and thereby sort of compromise the whole scheme. So a miner could say, look, if you want me to sequence your transaction, even though it's time locked, please show me the opening of it. And usually it's going to be very easy to prove that a certain thing was opened in a certain way in all of these schemes. Okay, the second approach is the VDF one. Oops, sorry, let's go one slide back. The second approach is the VDF one, and you need to compute only one delay per block, but the operator can do some stuff and extract some value. Okay, so let's move on to the very last slide of this presentation. So I want to say that, Vdoo is going to appear on Starknet. So Cairo will have support for VDFs and time locks by a dedicated built-in that will do this. And then it means that you can have, when you're, programmers of Starknet smart contracts will be able to write all kinds of things like time lock based MEV protections. You could have VDF based MEV protection. So you could implement both of these two modalities that I spoke about previously using Vdoo as a built-in, as part of your basically code base for Cairo. And of course, there's going to be a lot more that you can do with it that is outside of MEV. You could do second price auctions, which again can be some solution for, or all kinds of sealed bid auctions. You can have lotteries, leader election, proof of stake protocols, and more. All of these things will be programmable very efficiently on L2, and I hope that people will, build applications with this. And I just want to say that as we're prioritizing the set of built-ins and things that will go into the Cairo programming language, it would be really, really cool to collaborate with teams that actually want to use this in production as soon as possible. We have already deployed Vdoo as a service, in production on mainnet Ethereum. Sadly, no one's using it right now. We'd love for people to come up and say they want to use the version of it that will be part of Cairo. So please talk to us. Happy to answer any questions, and thanks.
Thank you, Eli. Any questions, please post them in the chat. Okay, no questions. Okay, we have a comment from Alex. I am worried about the impact on markets, like price lag between centralized exchanges and Vdoo-enabled liquidity pools.
Yeah, so I mean, there's one variant that I really like that could give you sort of the best of both worlds. It would look something like this. So you process in real time the orders based on the current market conditions, and you understand that actually the sequencing may be such that some people win more or lose more based on the sequencing, and maybe even the miners have been playing games here. But the protocol then has a reconciliation period, which means that you will take so after all these orders have been done, the smart contract will take the sequence of orders, randomly permute them according to a VDF, and let's say 2 minutes or 5 minutes later, we'll run this reconciliation protocol that will either transfer funds or leave some of the funds outside and remunerate randomly according to your order. So what this would mean, as a user, I think you would get, this would be like the sweet spot, unless you're in the business of extracting value, right? Because you could get immediately, you want to, let's say, access Uniswap and get something, you'll get pretty much the final price, but there'll be this random delta that you will, learn of like 5 minutes later. So if you bought $1,000, you got $1,000 worth of whatever token it is, but maybe after 5 minutes it's going to be, either $1,010 or it's going to be $990 based on the random, the randomness that comes out of Vdoo. So I think this would give you the immediacy of a centralized exchange and the fairness of as if you applied Vdoo. That's my preferred, but it's more elaborate logic.
Oh, I see. Interesting. It's kind of reminiscent of probabilistic payments, where kind of in expectation you have the behavior that you want and it's fair, but in real time on a discrete basis there could be quite a bit of variance.
Yeah, or here you get because the downside of using a delay function is, well, the delay. So what if you could have the immediacy of like acting immediately, but you understand that the delay will be used for this fairness and reconciliation? I think this would be, so on layer 1, I think the gas cost would really kill it today, but on layer 2, this can be easily done, right?
Right. I mean, maybe a potential other way to address delay with time locks is to have some sort of optimistic happy path where you reveal the time lock ahead of time, as in before it kind of expires. And so in the happy case, you have near zero delay, but in the worst case where things go wrong, then things are ordered using cryptography.
So I saw there was a question. So I see here that Klaus from Vega brought this up. So Klaus from Vega, if you want to work on this, on layer 2 using Cairo, please, DM us, me. Let's get this thing rolling. I think this is, again, on layer 1, it would be very gas costly, but on layer 2, I think this would work marvelously well, this kind of thing, and we can make it happen. I saw there was another, wouldn't Vdoo incentivize spam? Tina is asking. I'm not sure why would Vdoo incentivize spam? Oh, like time locks, or like if I can time lock spam, I guess. Yeah, so you could have a collateral that would be slashed or something if you do that stuff. I confess that my preference is this immediacy plus a reconciliation. Later on, it's also just one VDF, and you get instant gratification and then near instant reconciliation. I'd like to see. Okay, I'm not sure. Are there any more questions? Because I think my time is up.
I don't think there's any more questions. Okay. Tina, is there a break between part 1 and part 2?
So there's a panel that we skipped that we kind of went into discussion while waiting for Ellie. So we can bring that on, or we can kind of skip to the part 2 and then have the panel towards the end. So up to you.
Guys, I apologize. I have to jump off to my family event, but thanks so much for having me. And I apologize for running a few minutes late.
No worries.
Thanks, Alex.
Thank
Bye.
you for the presentation.
Thank you for joining, Ellie.
Bye, guys.
Thanks, Eddie. Bye. I don't really have a preference. Happy to start the second part, I guess.
Sure. Let's start the second part and then have a panel.
Actually, people in the chat are saying panel. So let's do the panel.
All right.
So we have 3 panelists, Vitalik, Phil, and myself.
Hello.
Hello, hi everyone. So I guess I was asked to prepare a couple of questions for the panel. So maybe I'll just go through those quickly and then we can kick off the discussion. So the topic is MEV and scaling, and I guess my first question is kind of qualitative and my second question is quantitative. So the qualitative question is optimal MEV extraction in the context of scaling a centralization force, right? Because we have these block proposers. In order to do optimal MEV extraction, they need to be aware of all shards, all blockchains, all rollups. So they basically need to be a super node with lots and lots of computational power. They potentially need a team of analysts, a team of PhDs, whatever. And if you zoom out, I know how to kind of decentralize everything except this block proposing. And this is kind of one of the last unknown. So that's my first question. Second question is quantitative, and it's like, what will happen to the fee market when we scale? Like, for example, one of the questions I'm interested in the context of ultrasound money is, do base fees completely disappear, right, when we have lots and lots of scaling? Or will there be some sort of dip, but then it will go back up? Or what are other considerations around scaling? Is it possible that maybe because we have lots of scaling, lots of shards, there's going to be many more fees, and so this is even going to make the centralization problem even worse, in the sense that not only do we have these centralized actors, but they're going to be incentivized to be super large because of all the economic activity. Like if Ethereum becomes like the financial hub for the whole internet and the whole world, that's kind of scary. So anyone want to take question 1 or question 2?
I think question 2 is easy. Base fees are never going to 0 because there is always demand for all sorts of uses of the blockchain if prices go low enough. Like, at some point, some miner is going to spin up a service where the blockchains just get used as a store to back up people's cat pictures. So, like, we don't know what that floor is going to be, but it's there.
Right. But do you expect we'll be in this deflationary mode after, for example, sharding?
I would think on net, if anything, like the fees would be more. They might be less individually, but I think at least anecdotally, we've seen every time capacity gets increased, like there's a dip for a little while as the existing level of activity is now like too little, but then like pretty quickly there's like a return to the mean at some point. And like on net, I think there's usually more profit for miners after each one of these cycles. So I would at least personally expect the same thing to happen, but it's hard to say, I guess.
Right. And this is definitely what we've experienced kind of historically. Like the total amount of fees just goes up only.
Yeah. As for the first question, I think it's interesting and it's like super concerning. I agree that MEV is a centralization force. I think there's a question of like how much of a centralization force it is and like how much of a advantage decentralizing is there going to be, and like how much of that can we mitigate through either incentivizing like explicit decentralization or minimizing the centralization incentive. Like in the current form, it's very strong of a centralization incentive, I think. I think, so for example, like let's say without a network like Flashbots, which has like this searcher miner separation, it's a huge centralization incentive because you have the miners that each have their own infrastructure, and like unless you can reach the barrier to pay that engineering cost, you won't be competitive. And that's like what we were seeing with pools like Ethermine kind of having their own MEV infrastructure. I think adding in this more decentralized infrastructure where anyone can participate in either receiving profit or sending bundles is like a step towards making it more decentralized, if that infrastructure is decentralized, which today it's pretty much not. But let's say it is, right? Then that's a little bit more decentralized. But there's still, I think, somewhat of an advantage from participating at more layers of the stack. Like as much as we try to flatten this reward function into being linear on the validation power, where like with 20%, you have 20% profit, there still probably will be some economy of scale to size related around like your ability to build network infrastructure or have business partnerships with entities or whatever it might be. Like I still expect that curve to be a little bit above the linear curve. Like I expect size to continue being an advantage. So I think the only thing we can do is like try to squash that down as much as possible. But I still see it as being there and being a huge issue. But I'd be curious to hear what Vitalik thinks of this also.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I generally view these MEV efforts as being about like if centralization has to exist, like concentrating it in a particular type of actor so that all the other types of actors can still be basically just like plug into that and continue to have economies of scale that are as linear as they were before. I mean, it's obviously an open question, the extent to which that'll succeed. And then the other open question is, even if centralization at some particular layer happens, like to what extent does that turn into a risk for like actual underlying goals? So like censorship resistance, for example, right? Like if there is, say, like one, like professional trading company of some kind that starts producing 80% of all block orderings, then what does that what practical ability would that company have to like say stop me from sending my transactions onto the Ethereum blockchain if it decides that my that like it doesn't want those transactions included for whatever reason? Like, would I still be able to get my transactions included by paying an extra fee, and then the extra fees of everyone who gets excluded will kind of add up to be enough to to let some other aggregator get more reward? Will there be some alternative mechanism where I'll be able to get included with a one slot delay? Will there be something else? I don't know.
So here's a related question: is like, what are the goals of Ethereum, like with regards to decentralization? I know this is a very broad question, but I'm sure you've thought about it, because like to take that previous line of thinking to the logical extreme, like there's like EOS and Algorand on the other end. And like clearly we as a community want to be more decentralized than that, but like how do we set a target and like benchmark progress towards that and like design for that goal? Or how do we even start to think about quantifying that or promoting it?
Yeah, I think like one thing that we definitely needs to get better at is like actually kind of expressing our thinking about the ultimate goals behind decentralization, right? So like, are we concerned about EOS because they don't do the right rituals and pray to the right gods, or are we concerned about like EOS for very practical reasons? And my concern about the centralized platforms is definitely for very practical reasons, right? Like if you take either EOS or even one of the recent EOS-like platforms that have managed to get themselves into a position of higher respectability than EOS. Like, the question is, if the elites of that community get together and decide to force through some protocol change that the community finds unacceptable. So, this could be some kind of censorship. This could be like forking in some kind of issuance to like say themselves and claiming that they deserve it because they're the core developers, like something would be like preferential treatment for like KYC participants or like something, whatever, right? Would they be able to do this even if the community was just like really strongly opposes this? And in these centralized platforms, I think the answer is yes, right? Because there isn't a culture of running validating nodes, and there isn't a culture of that many people running nodes at all. And so, if the elites get together, they can schedule a hard fork, and they can even schedule it like 6 hours in advance. And then even by then 6 hours later, the users by default detect nothing. And then maybe 12 hours later, the users start detecting things. And by then, like, the hard forks already happened, and the users don't really have a way of like quickly making a user activated soft fork. The users don't really have a good way of coordinating a rebellion. And so like they've just basically successfully pushed it through. And like, what are you going to do? Are you going to revert like billions of dollars of economic activity in the last 6 hours and try to coordinate all of the block explorers and pools that disagree before there's even more activity? Like, you can't, right? Whereas on Bitcoin or Ethereum, like that sort of thing would very easily fail, right? Because like, first of all, the number of elites you have to coordinate is larger. You have more client developers, more core developers. Second, there's all these users running nodes, and then there's all these users that are actually verifying everything. And those users would have to be convinced to download the software. It would definitely take longer than 6 hours just because of sheer numbers. And so like your ability to pull off that kind of like forced protocol rule change in Ethereum or Bitcoin is significantly lower, right? So the question, I guess, or the one way of looking at the problem would be like, would a single dominant MEV extractor like change this calculus and like make it easier to pull off this kind of social attack? Now, like, clearly the MEV extractor would not be able to force through transactions that are invalid, but they would be able to censor, right? And so like the practical question is just like, like exactly how much ability to censor would they actually have? And like, what is that something that like users would be able to like find some way around quickly enough?
So I guess what I'm hearing is that the fundamental role of decentralization, in your view, at least in this perspective, is to maintain this power balance between the privileged actors in the system and everyone else, such that everyone else can check the power of these actors and stop them from pushing through unpopular changes unilaterally.
Right. I mean, I think that's definitely like a way of describing a large part of what the value of decentralization is there to do. Probably not 100%. I think like there's other reasons to like and wants decentralization too, but I think it's definitely a significant piece.
One of the things that we've tried to do in the design of View 2 is minimize the power of these privileged actors as much as we can. And I guess maybe one way to tackle MEV is to basically constrain the block proposers as much as we can. And I'm just thinking out loud here, but maybe there's an opportunity to somehow constrain the strategies that they have for block creation. So they have to commit ahead of time saying, this is going to be my search algorithm. And I'm going to adhere to it. And if I don't adhere to it, I can't create blocks, or I'll get penalized. And then maybe there could be some sort of Yarn style open sourcing of strategies. So anyone can submit strategies. These strategies kind of get run maybe in a distributed fashion, and then the most like the winning strategies, a portion of the income goes to those who wrote the strategies. So, and then maybe there could be some sort of social pressure to push for at least the centralized entities like the pools to adhere to basically constraining themselves artificially in the context of block production.
So I think like that broad marketplace is kind of what Flashbots is trying to build in a way, but I think there's still like a lot of the variability and a lot of the power of these entities comes also from their infrastructure. So like the network infrastructure, like how do you police whether they heard a message or not, or whose message they heard first? I still think that is like kind of the fundamental source of like why they need to provide this input into the system. And I guess there's a question there of like how much of this P2P networking attribution side is like, does ETH kind of view as core infrastructure versus like, you know, kind of designed to be changed and customized? And if so, what are the desired properties of that layer?
Right. So I guess, you know, it's kind of the classic separation of data availability and execution. I mean, we can completely remove the unfairness in execution, but there would be, you know, potential unfairness in the data availability. And I guess one thing we could potentially do is look at these off-chain data availability committees, and that might be a way to go from purely centralized, as in there's one single actor, to some sort of committee, which might be more acceptable, more palatable long term.
Yeah, so I think basically that's the chain link fair sequencing protocol, is trying to bootstrap that from a committee. I guess the question is just like what inherent trade-offs are there, and like where does it fall in the L1, L2 DApp responsibility funnel distinction? Like, because obviously as you go down that, the design needs to be more general and work for a broader class of people. Like L1 needs to be the trade-off space that's most optimal for a huge number of people, and then like L2 can be more specialized, and the DApp can be like super specialized. So where do we fit that in, I guess, is a good open question. Do you think L1 is the best place?
No, I'd say definitely not L1. And the reason is, in order to do that data availability and sequencing, you need to have a really good internet connection, because you're basically connected to all these mempools and whatnot. So it would have to be semi-centralized. But I guess the good news is that at the very least, we can get this federated security. So there's kind of a lower bound on the security we could get. Because when we select a committee at random at layer 1, we're assuming that these are Raspberry Pis running on a home connection. So they can't really do like the high bandwidth data availability.
Yeah, interesting. So there is going to be like a natural specialization vector there, I guess. And as you said, it comes from both the data availability issue, and I think also the like network asynchrony aspect of like, we want people all over the world to participate, and we need this network asynchrony. It's like a fundamental part of how we're going to coordinate them. So yeah.
Right. Okay, so if we have a bit of time, not sure we do, Tina, interrupt me if we don't, but like my last question, I guess, is kind of a meta question, is what are things you're most worried about? Like, what are maybe some of the known unknowns, or maybe unknowns for which you have some intuitions? What are these scaling things that you're worried about in the context of MEV?
I would love Vitalik to take this one first, because I think.
And I think this like cross-chain MEV extraction issue that you mentioned is definitely one of them.
Right.
Yeah. Aside from that, will demand for low block times lead to centralization issues, like pretty much no matter how we satisfy that demand, even if we satisfy it with fancy layer 2 schemes. And then also there's just like centralization risks on the like staking liquidity side, like basically what staking in ways that open up centralization vectors just like have fundamentally better capital efficiency properties by enough to encourage people to like stake in pools that are, I guess, I want to say like custodial, but like the reality is there is going to be a spectrum, and like the question is like where on the spectrum would they be, like would it be most capital efficient to stake in pools where basically the custody properties of that ETH become such that they open up opportunities for attackers to like grab up and attack and control a large portion of the stake power. But that's like less of an MEV issue and more of a DeFi capital efficiency issue.
And what? Go ahead, Phil.
No, go ahead.
No, I mean, one thing that just came to mind is the question whether MEV is objective or subjective, in the sense that like we're kind of assuming that MEV is an objective thing and we can minimize it, but actually maybe like there's some privileged actor not in the blockchain world but in the real world. So let's imagine that you're a government, you're a privileged actor there, and so you can do things that others can't do, and maybe we're going to have like perfect equality on the blockchain, but because these other actors have privileges, we're going to have this subjectivity of MEV. Like one transaction might be worth 0 to most people, but to a government it could be worth a ton of money.
Yeah, I think that's super interesting, like thinking about the full space of manipulation people will do, because you see it in the financial markets where like people will use some weird obscure power they have and like also do some trade like over there, and like these two things line up really nicely for them and they make a bunch of money and like something
Right.
happens and people don't know. So yeah, I expect there's going to be a lot of shenanigans. In terms of things I'm most worried about, I think it's the same as it's always been with MEV, which is that like Goldman Sachs starts the MEV division and like they're just fantastically good at it, and like everyone buys the license to like have Goldman Sachs tell them what order to mine transactions in, because that's the best way, and there's like not a network there, it's just like very top down. So basically ETH turning into Robin Hood in an order flow sense. That's kind of what I worry about, and also how this interacts with like large exchanges in POS, like Binance and Coinbase, and how that also plays with the correlated slashing and the correlated failure incentives. Like, are those incentives kind of enough to prevent centralization? Is the meme enough of their existence? Like, will they kick in at the right time and kind of have the right effects? I think those are all open questions I have on scaling.
Okay, fantastic. Tina, how are we doing on time?
We are just in time. So perfect timing for Carl to switch on and talk about Miva, or rap about Miva. I am very excited to see Carl make through his presentation in time. I will make a beeping sound if you cannot go through 169 pages in 15 minutes. Feel free to share screen.
You don't think I can do it? Wow. Okay, let's go. You're right. I'm not gonna lie. I will have a timer as well so that we can see. Anyway, hello everybody. I am Carl, and today we are going to talk about Miva, MEV auctions, also sequencer auctions, also just like generally, what is this, what is MEV, like what can we do with it? And why is this extremely exciting, in my opinion, for just like literally the entire internet and the way that we work and communicate together? Because more things are communication problems than you might imagine. So anyway, first, why is this such an exciting topic? I think that the reason why this is such an exciting topic is because I love open source, and blockchains, Miva, blah, blah, blah. We'll talk about how this works, but blockchains give a business model to open source. This is my claim. And I think that this is actually pretty accurate and pretty revolutionary. And in fact, blockchains give a business model to public goods in general, right? The ability for us to build things that aren't necessarily extractive, but instead get used. And when they are used, maybe you are rewarded in some way that doesn't incentivize you to, like, you know, hoard and whatnot. You know, like, it's this beautiful future that we can potentially have. And I really do believe that it is possible. So, you know, I've been working in this crypto space for a while, and guess what? I've, you know, working on all these various projects. They're all open source and they're all public goods. And so there is this fundamental thing where it's like, okay, it's amazing to be able to work on this technology, give it out for free, et cetera, but how is this actually being funded? Like, I'm not gonna lie, like, you know, I got paid for all of my work. I'm not just like doing it out of the goodness of my heart alone, right? And I would say that a large portion of where this came from is just the fact that ETH itself got bigger and bigger, and the network effect grew and grew, and the price grew and grew, and then people started reinvesting, and it got bigger and bigger, and just showered ETH on everybody, right? And that's like legitimately how all of these open source projects have been funded in, you know, to some extent. And so, yay, you know, blockchains gave a business model to public goods, these public goods that I was working on, and that many of us have been working on. So you know, but it's like, is that really the business model? Like, we patronage essentially from, you know, or reinvestment into ETH. It's not terrible. I'm not going to say that it's like a bad thing, but it doesn't feel as sustainable long term. And so here's why it doesn't feel super sustainable. Because users, right, they have a bunch of, you know, ETH and you know, crypto, and they use dApps. And then those dApps essentially pay miners, because you end up spending a transaction fee. You end up getting, you know, arbitrage profit taken from you, whatever it is. And then developers make these dApps, and they're just kind of like, oh, okay, well, you know, I'm just going to deploy my smart contract, and now it exists. And now guess who's getting paid for it? It's not the developer, it's the miners, right? And so this is like a kind of like wacky scenario, and doesn't seem particularly sustainable. And I'm not saying that developers need to, you know, make all of this cash, but this is an issue. Anyway, so the miners are making miner extractable value. And just imagine for one moment, imagine imagine that the miners had to actually pay the developers, right? That would be pretty sweet. And maybe what if miners literally paid everyone? What if we could all like use the blockchain? And guess what? The blockchain pays us back. That just seems like such a nice, like a kind of weird, like circular mindset and circular, you know, strategy that just seems like a great basis for an economy, you know, like every good economy is circular. Anyway, so, you know, this is an amazing future. And then we can all join in universal consciousness as we're paying ourselves and being good. Okay. I'll take a step back. But anyway, let's get into some meat and potatoes. And, you know, talk about miner extractable values. So what exactly is MEV? I think that I think that this concept is probably a lot more, you know, normalized now, thankfully. But I will still define it. I think it's useful. Basically, it's the revenue from being a miner. So it includes block rewards, it includes transaction fees, includes front running, includes slow market arbitrage, or there's probably a better word for that as well. But we often think of it as just front running, because that's the thing that gets like a lot of attention, but really it's all of the above. It's literally what can be extracted from running a miner, right? And, you know, shout out to Phil Dine for, you know, introducing. And so there is another form of MEV, and that is just the miner extractable value that you can make from 51% attacking the network, being bad, all that kind of stuff. You don't be bad, okay? And so we make this assumption in blockchains that the MEV for being honest, basically the you know, economic reward for being honest exceeds the economic reward for being malicious, right? So the miner is making money. What is keeping the miner from doing anything bad? Well, it's because it's making more money being good than it makes being bad. And that's great. But what happens what happens if the MEV honest is actually way bigger than the MEV malicious, right? Like, you know, I mean, and honest is a spectrum, right? Like if you're front running everybody, is that really honest? It's kind of like quasi honest. It's not necessarily, you know, great. It's not pro-social, pro-us, pro-community. It's more just like pro-you. So like what this big MEV honest is not necessarily a good status quo. Why, like, we should just taper that down a little bit and give back to us, give back to the community. And so when MEV malicious is low, especially, you know, proportionally to the MEV honest, and Casper and, you know, consensus protocols that are a little bit more, you know, have better security properties can actually achieve this, then we can extract that excess MEV, extract that minor extractable value. So that seems pretty fun. So now I'm going to talk about MEVA. So MEVA, notably, there's kind of like, it's a little bit of an ambiguous term at this point. So I'll try to make the distinction pretty clear. And we can, yeah, I'll go into it. But anyway, so these are the sources of MEV, and we're not going to talk about extracting the block rewards. We'll just talk about extracting the transaction fees, front running, slow market arbitrage. And by the way, I'm a big fan of the, you know, the previous talk where we can actually eliminate much of front running just by using some, you know, commit reveal / time lock crypto, which I'm very excited for. But anyway, here we are. These things we can extract. And that's a solid chunk of change, you know? Okay, so first, gas auctions. You know, we currently have, you know, priority gas auctions. Flashbots is working on much more sophisticated kinds of auctions here. And those are, by the way, called MEVA as well. So I'm sorry, it's a little bit of a confusing term because there's a lot of auctions all over the place, and there are auctions for MEV all the time. So anyway, you know, users or arbitrage bots or whomever are submitting transactions to the miner. The miner is about to create a new block. Sorry, I got to give a little bit more context here. The miner is creating a new block, figuring out what transactions go in it. And so how are they going to do this? Well, they're going to hold an auction. And that auction, you'll have the participants be either the users, arbitrage bots, flash bots, you know, etc. And they will send these transactions, which express some, you know, desired, you know, inputs to be included in this block. And it'll, you know, propose this modification. And it can be conditional. It can be arbitrarily complicated. It's very, you know, it can be very interesting. And at a very simple level, the miner is going to choose the transactions that provide the most value to the miner, right? Pay the highest gas price, pay the highest fee. And so that is the transaction that is going to be mined, and that is the ordering of the transactions that will be mined, et cetera. And the miner will make that gas times the gas price. And so the MEV plus equals transaction fee, right? We just got some money from including transactions. So that's an MEV auction. And that is one sense of the term. And so I think I'm going to start disambiguating these terms a little bit and just call the next one a sequencer auction. And that's what I'm talking about when I say, like, you know, extract the MEV. You know, let's talk about a sequencer auction. So the sources of MEV, right? We just got transaction fees, but now notably, this is, you know, this also works for arbitrage, right? You know, if there's a free arbitrage opportunity, everyone's going to be wanting to take advantage of it. They'll all be bidding, and they'll bid up to essentially how much money there is to be made. And so this is just to like give a feeling for how the miner actually makes the arbitrage opportunities in some kind of like perfectly competitive market situation. Now, MEV plus equals the arbitrage opportunity on the chain. That's pretty crazy. And, you know, I included this little Flashbots 2.0 diagram of these gas price auctions, because, you know, they bid each other up until, you know, pretty close to the value that they're going to make. Anyway, so those cover all of the other, you know, sort of forms of MEV. And now let's talk about sequencer auctions. So miner, another word for miner, part of what a miner does is it sequences the transactions in a block. And so that sequencing is the thing that we're going to like focus on. And so I'll instead talk, right, they order these transactions. And so I'm going to actually just call it a sequencer, call the miners a sequencer. sometimes I forget I have animations that describe what I'm saying. So then I have to play them back. Anyway, okay. So this is that auction that we just had, right? Users paying transaction fees, extracting MEV for I'm sending MEV, essentially transferring MEV to the sequencer. So what if we had an auction for being the sequencer itself? So let's hold an auction and let's say, okay, if you want to be a sequencer and you want to make this juicy profit, why don't you bid for that right, that privilege? Well, we can expect that the bids will be the expected MEV, gained minus the operational costs of being a sequencer. And guess where that money can go? First it was going to the sequencer. Where's this money going to? It's going to Facebook. We're going to send all the money to Facebook and Google and Amazon. No, I'm just kidding. Imagine a future where we send it to Ethereum, send it to us, send it to the community, send it to not just, the Ethereum community, everybody, right? Like, if everyone's going to be using this blockchain, it better be good for all of us. Build public goods. So, one thing that I'll just point out, although I don't have that much time, so I'll just, mention it. One thing that we need to do for this to work is we need to have really good open source software that commoditizes being a sequencer, right? We want to make it so easy to extract the MEV in the way that we want it to be extracted. So essentially, right, we may not want any front running to be possible. We may want to require that all transactions are, encrypted and with commit reveal schemes and whatnot. Like that is something that we definitely want to do, but we need to commoditize being a sequencer for this MEV extraction to actually work and to be, something that doesn't get itself captured. And then, okay, I don't remember what that MEV greater than, okay. What's with this optimism? So that's what I'm working on, right? We're building optimistic rollup, the OVM, optimistic Ethereum. We are scaling Ethereum. I forgot to give that context in the beginning. It's very important. It's a very important project. So anyway, MEVAs, whoops, sorry about that, can be implemented on top of optimistic rollup. And we got a charter to enshrine public access to public goods. So that's pretty great. And MEVAs can fund public goods. In fact, they should fund public goods. And maybe they must fund public goods because we're not gonna, who is going to accept a future where blockchains aren't giving back to ourselves? So anyway, currently we're sad. Let's make ourselves happy. This might be sequencer auction. We can call it sequencer auction. Anyway, and then we'll fund tons of awesome public goods, give a business model to public goods. They're going to fund public goods. Blockchains will fund them. In fact, we will fund public goods. In fact, we will give back to ourselves, right? This is what this is fundamentally about. Value is subjective. All this stuff is subjective. We're all just kind of slurping around in a soup. We need a good, non-extractive system. We want a little circle. We want that circular logic. That's what I'm all about. Just kidding. Great. Look at these rich people. Although I guess it's right here pretty centralized. We gotta spread the money around a little bit more in my next image. Anyway, that's public goods funding. I don't know how to distribute the funds. We've got Gitcoin grants and whatnot, but I believe we can do it. Love knows no borders. And thank y'all. That's optimism. Check out optimism. Check out optimistic Ethereum. Check out MEVA, and shout out to all these folks. That's me. I think I hit it. I think I hit the 15 minutes. I'm 11 seconds over. Let's go.
Yay, congratulations, Carl. Good job. Do we have any questions for Carl? No questions from Eve TV chat, but awesome presentation. I guess I have one, maybe questions, if there's no question. So I guess one option for redistribution is burn, right? And that's the simple equal redistribution to everyone. What is your intuition in terms of how inefficient the burn is? If we were to, focus the money on specific projects, how much more can we get? How much more bang for the buck could we get?
Great question. So I think intuitively that there is value in having some sort of redistribution mechanism that is a little bit more complicated. The reason why I think this is the case is because we do currently redistribute, a lot of value based on, I work on some project, I'm like, convince some venture capitalists to like pay me some money, and then I go out and I build my thing, and then it makes everyone a bunch of money. That's like a very sophisticated like money redistribution system. And I think that it gets even more complicated. You introduce taxes, you introduce government subsidies, all of these things. I think that it is just kind of the nature of the problem of like collective value and collective, value distribution. It's essentially like a preference function on like what we as a, human civilization like want. And so I just think that preference function is going to be quite complicated. And I'm not sure if there's like one distribution system to like rule them all, or if we can just do like, okay, this is a really simple one. Let's just like focus on that only. I think it's one of many.
So here's my kind of counter argument for the burn, basically just a simple burn. And like the first one is, you kind of mentioned it, is like, if you don't burn, then you have all sorts of questions around credible neutrality, right? So burn gives you credible neutrality. I guess the other thing is that the burn, is part of the ultrasound money thesis. I keep shilling the ultrasound money thesis, but there is a possibility that Ether will become, in the same way that Ethereum could become the internet of money, ETH could become the money of the internet, with tons of monetary premium. And if we focus on this one thing, the burn, then I think we have a higher chance of ETH becoming kind of this ultrasound money. And the fact that ETH becomes ultrasound money gives us all sorts of rippling effects. It means more security for Ethereum. It means more economic bandwidth. It means all of these other good things. So I think the trade-offs need to be carefully weighted as to whether we want to be very ad hoc or just be credibly neutral and reinforce the burn.
Yeah, don't get me wrong. I'm feeling the burn too. I'm feeling the burn. But it's really just an argument that, there are probably multiple ways to skin a horse. I'm not sure if that's not, but there are multiple ways to go about it. And I think that, we definitely need to burn, and we probably are going to want to be doing other things. And in fact, my thought is, the most exciting mechanisms are the mechanisms that have sub-mechanisms and sub-mechanisms, like composable things that incentivize really good behavior. So if you said like, okay, if you say like this mechanism, let's say it's the burn, let's say it's something else, has this consequence of, funding innovation, giving back to, people who need it, just like generally like rising bringing everyone up, then that is like that. And those sub mechanisms are all dependent on like, you do this burn, and then you like kind of like have this ripple effect of all these other things happening. That's what I'm interested in. So like, if for me to feel the most burn, that's what I would, that's where I really just would love to see. It's like, okay, yeah, that's how you do the burn, and then the whole world's burning. I don't know, in a good way,
Excellent. Thank you, Carl. We don't have any more questions. So I guess we could move on to the next talk. Tina, do you want to introduce the next speaker?
Yes, next will be Georgios.
Is the thing on? Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, great. And now you can probably also see my screen. Cool. Is the screen on too?
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. So thank you all for coming. Thank you, Carl, for the very energetic presentation as usual. My presentation is going to be a lot more vanilla, and will make a lot of assumptions about what the audience already knows because we've already heard a lot. So skipping through, I'm Georgios. I work at Paradigm, a venture capital firm, and I'm a research partner here. So let's talk about MEV. And before we talk about MEV in layer 2, maybe it's worth kind of understanding what the questions we should ask when talking about MEV are. And firstly, let's preface this by saying that I don't think that we can remove it fully, but we can minimize it. And there's various layers of the system which we can touch on towards minimizing MEV. One of that is on the protocol layer, on the very base layer. There's a lot of parameters. There's how block producers are chosen, because maybe the block producers, as we saw earlier in the discussion, are random, but maybe they're predictable. And if they're predictable, what are the implications of that for MEV? Maybe if many block producers are predictable, maybe it's more likely that they collude and that they end up maybe doing multi-block MEV extractions like time-banded attacks. It's also another good question to ask is, are transactions in the clear? So are transactions submitted to the sequencer encrypted, or are they submitted clear text? If they're encrypted, what is the mechanism to decrypt them, and so on? With respect to ordering, who owns the ordering? Is it always the sequencer or the block producer or the miner that owns the ordering operation? Or is there some consensus enforced operation which randomizes transaction ordering? This is also very important. What about finality? Does the protocol have finality? How long is that finality? Finality is a big factor when you're thinking about time-banded attacks, again, in the multi-block MEV extraction scenario. Separately from that, on the network layer, there is a question to ask around Byzantine fault-tolerant proof of stake versus the proof of stake that we have in Ethereum. For example, in Tendermint, the MEV cannot, there's no notion of time-banded attacks, because once a block is mined, once a block is validated, there's no way to roll it back. But perhaps the MEV extraction happens at the network layer during when the gossip protocol plays itself out and validators try to decide which transactions they should mine. On the network layer also, because I didn't add it because we've talked about it a lot, and after all, we're in Flashbots MEV roast, there's Flashbots also, which allows you to basically, instead of having the main communication channel, you try to introduce another one, such as the Flashbots kind of like second mempool, and that allows you to introduce new rules on the network layer there. Finally, on the application layer, there's things which you should consider around MEV, such as, you know, thinking about it from first principles. MEV is exposed when anybody can, when there's like races on the application layer, it gets exposed when there's races towards touching the same piece of state. For example, when there's, let's say, an order on Uniswap and they both touch the same, all orders touch the same reserve variables. So something that could improve things, or for example, in a liquidation. So something that could improve things would be that maybe you try to introduce some ordering on the actors that try to go after an MEV opportunity. And an example of that would be KeeperDAO's K-compound protocol, where instead of allowing anybody to liquidate, you know, they just allow certain parties to execute liquidations based on the DAO elected liquidators. Similarly done by B protocol, again, on liquidations. So like the general notions that you try to remove this sort of anybody can liquidate, anybody can arb, and you try to introduce different structures in the way that actors interact with the system. So now that we have kind of the basic questions on how we should be approaching the problem, it's worth maybe looking at it from the angle of layer 2s. So just to say the very basic things, the layer 2s, like since the dawn of layer 2s with the sidechains papers, what they were saying is that they let us experiment without fear of the layer 1, like weird things happening to the layer 1. So we can start introducing crazy features on the layer 2 while being relatively conservative on the layer 1. But the kind of layer 2s that we have right now, which are mostly rollups, whether it's the optimistic or the ZK variants, more or less the mental model should be that it's just another layer 1, again, with respect to MEV and the previous questions, and that it just has some additional mechanism which allows it to inherit Ethereum security. Beyond that, there is nothing too specific to the layer 2. And something to note is that whenever the layer 2 is more programmatic, for example, Fuel is a slightly more restricted computationally rollup compared to, let's say, Starkware or ZK Sync or Optimism and Arbitrum. kind of if you think about it in a spectrum. And so more programmability always will mean more MEV. So that's how it should be thought about on the layer 2 layer. And then something which was also mentioned earlier is that when MEV gets extracted on layer 2, that means it does not get extracted on layer 1. So in a sense, we're not really removing MEV by introducing layer 2 systems. Rather, we're just moving it from one place to another, and we introduce certain rules there. And these rules may either be, mempool things, the block producer election, the things that Carl just talked to us about, or transaction randomization, or who knows what else. And kind of zooming in on that, on the MEV auction, I have like slightly more opinions, and Carl and I may disagree on this, that in a way the MEV auction forces everything to be on the sequencer, and the rational sequencer probably would want to extract as much MEV as they want or as they can. And it remains to be seen if kind of operating this benevolent sequencer model is good enough. There's another approach that we've seen by Arbitrum, which says that instead of kind of having like one sequencer that decides on the ordering, you introduce a BFT protocol on top, and you have all the parties in that BFT protocol agree on the transaction ordering. Again, that maybe works, maybe doesn't, for reasons that Phil has talked about in his blog post and in his talk. And that is because how do you elect these people? What happens? Does that move again the MEV from the actual consensus layer to the networking layer before, when the parties are trying to figure out who should, what transaction ordering should be followed? So, the takeaway basically is that there's no free lunch in any kind of mitigation that you introduce. And other approaches, of course, are classic cryptography-based techniques for kind of separating execution from ordering, which Eli alluded to some of them, and we've had these discussions in the past in the previous roasts. Something to note about MEV and optimistic rollup is specifically there's a statement which goes like, because miners can search through a fraud proof for zero cost, and by censoring a fraud proof, they can get paid counterfactually after fraud has been executed. You can say that all the funds in an optimistic roller could be considered MEV, because, well, the sequencer could collude with the miners, or the miners could be a sequencer, and they would make an invalid state transition, and everything would be censored for the entire dispute period. So if you're thinking about this completely in a vacuum, you're just thinking sequencer, miners, that's it, sure, I'll take it. But in crypto, there's lots of complex interactions, and we will see why this attack kind of collapses. And the reason is quite simple. We should think about it from two cases. One where miners just do a 51% coordination and they orphan any blocks which include the fraud proof. So there would be a chain split scenario where some miners decide to create them to accept the fraud proof. Some others don't, and effectively you have two Ethereums. This ain't gonna happen. Miners are long ETH. Any kind of attack on Ethereum in that way directly destroys their investment. So that aside, there's also another approach, which would be that maybe all the miners somehow get convinced to put their hash rate and say this transaction is bad, we should ignore it, or this transaction is rather we got bribed by this party to censor this transaction. So I don't have a formal proof for that, or some kind of intuitive game theoretic argument, but I don't see this possible at all. It destroys Ethereum's base settlement assurances, and it seems like a complete non-starter to me. So there's a very small nuance here that we just talked about transactions which would be good but get censored by miners. But what about transactions which are, let's say, bad? For example, somebody doing, let's say, money laundering on Optimism, and they want to withdraw these funds. So should miners accept a transaction that that allows a money launderer to exit their funds? And on that, I have no opinion. Ideally, if the base layer is properly distributed, this should never occur. Like the protocol behavior that is not able to distinguish here. But who knows what will happen, right? Like our understanding of blockchains evolves a lot over time. And just to kind of hint at things, because I know that we have a talk in the next MEV roast about cross-chain MEV, but just to kind of drive the point home, it's not just that the simplest systems and the most complex systems have various degrees of MEV, and of course with systems with various, with variant kind of degrees of composability or interoperability, but anytime any of these systems tries to talk with each other, it exposes MEV. And anytime a message is relayed from one place to another, there is a party that does this relaying. The relayer, you know, you call it whatever you want. And this relayer will have the ability to insert their own transactions, delay inclusion of your message, maybe reorder the transactions, and so on. So the question I pose to the audience is like, as blockchains start to become more complex and the interactions between them go up, will we be able to keep up with this complexity of MEV extraction? And how will our tools evolve on all this? And that was it. Thank you very much. And I'm happy to answer any questions, if any.
Thank you, Georgios. Great talk. Any questions? Again, great presentation. No questions from ETH chat. Oh, Alex has a question.
Yeah, but Justin, if you want to ask yours first, if you have any of the, yeah.
I always have one question in my back pocket, just in case no one has questions. I'm happy to go after you, Alex. Go ahead.
All right. So I'm still wrapping my head around layer 2. So thank you, Georgios. That was a great presentation. So I have a question related to layer 2 submitting the rollup batches that were with transactions within that layer 2 already sequenced within that rollup batch to the data availability layer, so Ethereum, or to a shard in Ethereum. And if someone is doing cross layer 2 arbitrage, would they be concerned about which rollup batch is processed first by the data availability layer, or does that not matter at all? In the sense where you care about the sequencing of which batch is submitted first between two different layer 2s. Does that make sense at all to you, or am I missing something here?
So you're saying that there's two layer 2s, two sequencers, two data availability layers. Each one of the sequencers submit the data availability batch to their own system, and I am a party doing cross-chain arbitrage. And the question is,
so it's nearly that. It's two sequencers, two layer 2s, but the same data availability layer, right? So
it doesn't matter. I mean, maybe it does matter depending on the protocol implementation, but it shouldn't matter. Like from a client-side perspective, all you need to know is that like the data has been published somewhere. So for you, like as the DEX trader or whatever, medium, small size, it doesn't matter. Like what matters is that you have like the guarantee that the data is there. Yeah, so from the perspective of the individual protocol, I don't think that you need to care much about what happens on the remote layer.
Okay, cool, thank you.
There's a question from the chat about, do you think Infura, Alchemy, etc. are going to start extracting MEV soon? So firstly, Infura and Alchemy are not miners or validators to the best of my knowledge. They are just node providers. So they don't have any specific roles in the system or the ability to reorder transactions in whatever way. Whether they would do, there's maybe like a dark scenario in which, you know, Infura just start censoring transactions or start copying traders that use it. That's one possibility, but in reality, all the kind of legit traders, they use their own nodes and they have, you know, like proper peering with peers that are well peered and so on. So no, definitely not.
Okay, so it looks like we have two more questions. Question from YouTube. Do zero-knowledge proofs affect MEV extractability at all?
If you bought the argument that I made earlier, that the optimistic rollup is not affected by the attack that I mentioned from miners, then in practice, I don't think that layer 2 and zero knowledge has kind of like any added benefit over optimistic plus MEV. So I don't think so. I don't think that zero knowledge proofs affect MEV. Unless, unless of course you mean that you introduce a zero knowledge proof to maybe do the secret leader election or to do some things in the VDF and so on.
Okay, fantastic. And I think we have just 1 minute, and also I'll ask my question, which is, it seems that Paradigm is going big on MEV, like hiring a team internally that specializes in that, but also investing heavily in the broad MEV ecosystem. Can you talk about, the investment thesis around hiring all the MEV gigabrains?
I don't know about like us hiring any of the MEV gigabrains. We're very excited to be working with Flashbots, of course. I think that MEV is like an important trend that we identified early on. Both like Charlie and I were like looking at this from a while back. So I think that MEV is like one of the most important topics for Ethereum's future. And of course, we care a lot about Ethereum. So it seems very reasonable to me that we'd care about MEV and try to be close to it.
I see. So it's kind of like a defensive investment, kind of a hedge. You have all this ETH, you want to defend it because, the MEV is kind of a systemic risk.
I don't think it's necessarily a systemic risk, or well, maybe the nice way to put it is that we want to try, or like I would want it to be a force that makes us improve our systems and make them more stable. So it's, you can call it defensive, but maybe there's like a positive angle to it, is all I'm saying.
Okay, fantastic. I think we're up on time and we have our panel next with, I think Georgios is still on panel, Barry and Stani and David.
I believe everyone's here. And Georgios actually prepared extensively a set of questions. So props to that, as well as David from Synthetics also prepared some notes that we shared in the agenda, as well as some highlights on their consideration with L2 implementation. So all of this can be found in the agenda. So Georgios, go ahead.
Yep. So again, hey all, see you again. It would be nice to get a quick intro from our panelists, starting with Barry, maybe. Is Barry around?
Yeah, hey Georgios, I'm here. Yeah, so I'm Barry. I did a lot of work on L2 stuff, and I have done some work on the MEVA stuff, the minor extractable value auctions. So I'm excited to chat with the kind of more DeFi focused people and get their opinions on that.
Nice. Stani?
Hey everyone, I'm Stani Kuleshov. I'm the founder of Aave protocol, which is a interest rate market on Ethereum L1 and now in Matic as well. I've been building decentralized financial applications for a few years now, and starting with ETHLEN back a few years ago. Mainly, I'm pretty much involved in the products side and also building incentive models, and also kind of like helping on the risk assessment side and creating the risk framework. And yeah, that's about it.
Nice, thank you. And David?
Hey everyone, I'm David. So I joined Synthetics as a core contributor earlier this year. I first got involved with their project going back to 2018 when they were called Haven. So they since rebranded. I was the founder of a smart contract auditing company called BlockTrax. And then after that, I ended up working on a database company. So it wasn't necessarily in crypto. And then very excited to be back in DeFi. So looking forward to going over kind of, we're building a lot on optimism on L2. So very excited to share with some of the learnings, challenges, and stuff we're really excited about as we move forward.
Nice, thank you very much. So kind of to kickstart the discussion, it would be nice to hear from Stani and David, like some things about what kinds of MEV do major DeFi platforms expose today? I imagine that both Aave and Synthetics have some things to say on that. Maybe starting with Stanley.
Yeah, sure. Well, two kind of occasions I would say, usually in occasion of liquidations, for example. So Aave as a protocol has, we have a collateralization system. So when you deposit into the protocol, then you can borrow value out of the protocol against your collateral. And to keep that collateral position, you might need to refill depending how the market moves. So if it's moved substantially, the market decreases, you might have to refill the collateral, or it might get liquidated. And how the liquidation network works in Aave protocol and pretty much across the whole DeFi ecosystem is that there's certain type of incentives available for the liquidators. So whoever actually takes that position and replaces the collateral with the borrowed funds will also get a margin for that particular transaction. Now, what's interesting here is that the liquidators that are in Aave are also liquidating other positions in other protocols as well, and depending on the incentives. And because it's an open network, everyone is kind of like fighting on getting that particular incentive model. And because these some of the assets are very volatile in the sense as crypto native as by itself, what happens is that the incentives are quite wide in their spread, for example, and we have a fixed incentive system to kind of ensure that when the market decreases substantially, we have enough liquidators coming and actually fighting to get that juicy incentive. And this is kind of like an interesting part because many of the liquidations actually happens with flash loans, which practically means that you might not need upfront capital to do certain type of liquidation, but you can actually flash borrow from the protocol, make the liquidation, don't use any capital, and just collect the spread. And this is where the MEV actually has its own risk, I would say. And in general, when it comes to flash loans, so our protocol is a flash loan protocol, so you can not just borrow against a collateral, but you can borrow for one particular transaction with sub-transactions, doing, for example, arbitrage. Let's say that you borrow from Aave, you buy an asset in market, one market, let's say Uniswap, and you sell it in another market, Kyber, for example. And this is also kind of like opportunity where the value can be extracted by the miners. So at least those two cases are something that's very familiar to us.
And David?
Cool, yeah. So if you're familiar with synthetics at all, I mean, one of the biggest challenges any DeFi protocol faces is getting liquidity in the system. And so the way we've designed our liquidity system is SNX stakers come on to the platform, they stake their SNX, and then they mint SUSD, which is kind of the entry point into the synths world on synthetics. And so on synthetics, we support a number of different synthetic assets, anything from synthetic ETH and synthetic Bitcoin to fiat synthetic currencies. We have a synthetic oil, and there's commodities, and now we've added equities such as synthetic Tesla and Coinbase, et cetera. And so how the liquidity for those assets gets created is through the stakers. And we have this thing called the debt pool. And so when people stake, debt gets created in the system. And when traders come on and they trade, let's say you wanted to go from SETH to SBitcoin, or I guess lately you'd probably want to go from SBTC to SETH, which is pretty exciting. You would essentially be trading against the debt pool, right? There is no counterparty. You're trading peer to contract, right? And in that sense, the risk for front running, the risk for people taking advantage of price discrepancies and price oracles and stuff like that, the risk is borne by the stakers. So it's a little bit of a unique problem that's specific to synthetics. Normally, if you were trading on something like Uniswap, the trader would be at risk for front running and other MEV risk areas. So it's a bit different for us. And so because of that, we've had to deal with several challenges around the user experience. So this is a big kind of ongoing trade-off between how do you really nail the user experience, especially for us as people come on to do trading with different trading strategies, with security and making sure that the stakers and the people providing liquidity to the system aren't getting taken advantage of. And so on L1, we had to introduce this thing called fee reclamation, which it has obviously the benefit of not being front runnable, because we basically, when you make a trade, you basically have to wait 6 minutes for the trade to settle. And when you wait 6 minutes, we basically are looking for price changes during that period, and we'll take those into account, whether depending on the price that you get. So the point there is that hurts from the UX, like no trader really wants to wait 6 minutes for the trade to settle. And then also for composability, right? Like if we wanted to integrate with Aave, it becomes challenging because of that waiting period. And so as we look to move to L2, we're trying to do everything we can to get rid of fee reclamation and feel confident that our system is not, and the stakers aren't exposed to unnecessary risk. So a couple of the differences between L1 and L2 is on L2, so we're building on top of Optimism, and there's no mempool on Optimism. And so because of that, that relieves one attack vector where people could look at the transactions coming in the queue, and they can basically say, I'm going to pay a higher gas price, and I'm going to basically have my transaction execute before this. And so the transactions are just going directly into the sequencer on L2, which is, obviously there's benefits to that. The cons of that is that currently Optimism is running the sequencer. And so there's some centralization aspect to it in today's state. And so there's been a lot of discussion, like Carl just gave a presentation on Miva, and then there's conversation from Chainlink around fair sequencing and stuff like that. And those mechanisms are designed to help bring more decentralization to the sequencer not being able to order transactions, right? Because Optimism has every reason not to shoot themselves in the foot in terms of messing with the order of transactions. But once, the plan is to move Optimism away from running the sequencer to bring more decentralization where anyone could run the sequencer. But when that happens, we have to make sure that they can't, just order the transactions the way that they want, therefore affecting the system. So that's one kind of attack vector / thing we're working with. The other area is around price oracle latency. And this specifically, again, is a huge problem for synthetics because of the way the debt pool, like I explained, with the liquidity is structured. And so with that, some of the things we're doing is we are working with Chainlink to try to get the deviation threshold down. So the way that works is, let's say the deviation threshold for a Chainlink price oracle is 0.3%, right? That means that when there's a move in price, 30 bips, right? So I guess that would be like, your 0.3%. And so if there's a move above that, it causes the price oracle to update the price, right? And so you want that to be as low as possible, because that means you'll get more frequent price updates in the sense that there's, price movement. So we're working to get those down. Another thing we're doing is we're trying to, we have a heartbeat. The heartbeat's less relevant as far as this stuff goes, but the heartbeat is like, if the price hasn't gone above that threshold, right? There needs to be something that triggers a new price. And so the lower the heartbeat is, the better. The problem is that it gets expensive, right? If it's pretty low. So we're aiming for like a 1 hour heartbeat and stuff like that. And then I would say the last thing to kind of keep in mind there that's been something we're trying to do is, so we're launching with higher fees than we'd like to have, because higher fees, obviously is not ideal. Again, this trade-off between user experience for the traders and everything, but it does bring more security because, so for example, we're launching with like 75 bips, which is a 0.75%, structure, or at least that's what we're thinking. And obviously that helps make it so front running's not even worth it, right, for people. And so, but we want to our goal is to bring that down to like 30 bips, over time. So those are some other things. And then I guess, just did a fair amount of talking, so.
Yeah, thank you very much. That was very extensive. I think that, people will kind of look back at this kind of segment as how MEV and synthetics interact with each other. On the thing that you just said about optimism, just to ask a question to Barry, what do you think about the MEV auction? So yes, you were very early into like designing the mechanism. I earlier said some things about like not liking them so much. So I wonder what your thoughts are on MEV auctions and how they will define kind of the layer 2 block producer election game.
Oh, fun. Okay. So yeah, so okay, let me just give a little quick introduction to it. So I think that like MEV is a serious problem and we should do all we can to remove as much MEV as possible, but we should also try and mitigate the problem of MEV. So I see MEVA auctions, MEV extractable value auctions, as a way of mitigation. So that's kind of what I think. What, like, Georgios, what are your concerns about it?
Basically that it just doesn't solve much in a way. You just use it to elect your sequencer, and then yes, the sequencer of course receives all the MEV, and then what?
Well, okay, so theoretically, like because you have this auction to elect the sequencer, the value that the profit that they're making, like the majority of that profit should just be destroyed or else donated to some public goods. The idea is that like although MEV still exists in the system, what you're doing is you're capturing like some subset of it. And when you're doing that, you're kind of reducing the severity of it. Yeah, does that make sense?
To some extent, although it still seems to me that having some form of more low-level randomization scheme or separation between execution and ordering would be a more robust solution. But it seems like that maybe these two are complementary.
Yeah, I think we should have both. I mean, we can dig into this more, but I've also had some thoughts about the random ordering, but I'm not sure if that's the direction I want to take it in. The panel, I mean.
I think everybody would be interested in hearing how like random ordering and kind of like these mechanisms interact or will affect rather the rest of the DeFi ecosystem on layer 2. So maybe kind of worth scoping down like your thoughts into this.
Okay. Cool. Yeah, so I'm a little bit like, okay, so you do random ordering where like the block producer orders the transactions before they know what the transactions are. But like there's certain situations where this will be really bad, right? For example, if someone on Synthetics or Aave is getting liquidated, and let's say the reward for that is like 100 ETH, then people are incentivized to create like 100 ETH worth of transactions and just randomly put those out there on the off chance that they will be the first one. It turns it into this kind of lottery situation where you get this like burst of transactions appearing because people know that, oh, I probably won't get there, but if I do, it's like winning the lottery. So that's, for me, is one concern of the random ordering. I think someone raised that earlier during Ellie's talk, but I'm not sure if it really got described correctly. So I think that like the solution that I prefer is actually the time lock approach, where so basically what you do is you say, okay, here's my order. I'm going to place this order and it's going to be processed after some time delay. And the reason you have to use a time lock is because you don't want people to be able to place orders and then say that, okay, I'm not actually going to reveal that order. Yeah, so I think it's important to do both, but I'm skeptical about the random ordering approach. But I know other people have other opinions on that. I'd be interested to hear.
Got it.
It's interesting you mentioned like the kind of the liquidations use case, because so in terms of our roadmap, I don't know if you can pull up the second slide that I had, but this definitely becomes relevant if you think about like what we'll be rolling out. So currently we just have staking right on L2 on mainnet. We'll be rolling out exchanging like next, and then after that shorting synths, and then futures, right? And futures, the way we're designing the system is sort of like perpetuals, where you can specify leverage. And so once you start to specify, 5 times leverage on a position, the liquidations become like somewhat tricky and can be, so I think there is like a potential attack vector, kind of like Barry was saying there. So I think that's a pretty interesting thing I'd like to give more thought to.
One thing I'm thinking as well, kind of like what one solution will be. I mean, it's kind of like it's not an optimal solution because in one way and theoretically is that you can create governance-based permissions for liquidators. So practically, certain type of liquidators can liquidate, and that could be one option, that you have this like permissionless ability. That would be one way, but then again, like we're going against the permissionless nature of the blockchains and the DeFi itself. But to some extent, that could be one way to do it, especially if you use governance for this kind of solution. That might be pretty interesting.
Another thing Chainlink's talked about in their like fair sequencing stuff that they've been thinking about is basically encrypting the transactions so that the transaction content's only revealed after the ordering's been agreed on. So that's another kind of interesting thing. It's, you know, I don't know that much necessarily about it, but I know that that's something they've been trying to figure out. So
yeah, so my concern with this approach is that, like, what you have to do is you have to make sure that people are forced to reveal their order, because otherwise what I can do is I can make like potential orders and then refuse to reveal them if it's going to lose me money. So yeah, that's my thinking there. There has to be some mechanism to force the reveal of the order.
I agree with that critique. Yeah, exactly. It's a free option. Maybe moving forward, like, because we're kind of running on time, when like evaluating a layer 2 protocol, because Stanley, you have deployed yourselves on Matic, and I don't know what the rest of your plans are. And David, like, you've chosen Optimism. I wonder, do you take MEV mitigation or, you know, the strategy of the project around MEV into account? Does it matter? What's the deal? Does MEV matter for you, or is it like just an extra, nice to have? Maybe starting with time.
Personally, and kind of like in I would say that it matters quite a lot, because I mean it's definitely like an issue. But when it comes to deployments of a protocol in different, let's say, side chains, layer 2s and other maybe blockchains, what's kind of like what we usually follow is pretty much like what the community wants to do, like what kind of I mean, it's not like the biggest decisive thing, but also like when we deploy contracts into other networks, like it's part of the kind of like a technicality is that like how the functioning will be, and it's not just the MEV, but there's other kind of things like how easy it is to deploy contracts, for example. I mean, whether there's a EVM compatibility and so forth. So it plays some factor, but then again, I somehow see the space now a bit saturated with different kinds of chains, and many of the L2 solutions are not super ripe yet. I mean, it's still kind of like very early, but definitely that would be something that affects quite a lot, especially if you see more and more issues related to MEV and incur. But I guess like for us, the most kind of like a key part where it might happen is the liquidations, and as long as most of the liquidations work, it's not a problem. But the kind of risk is that if kind of the liquidators' incentives are lost, and in that sense, there's less and less liquidators coming into the spot when actually you need them the most. So that's kind of like the problematic part, I would say. But yeah, I mean, it's a consideration, and but still, it's just part of the tech we're looking and assessing when we deploy the protocols.
Yeah, I would just say, you know, I think it's definitely a consideration. I think if I kind of think about like, why did we choose Optimism in the first place? So, you know, the way we kind of looked at it was like, how do we mitigate risk as a whole, right? So obviously, you know, maybe MEV falls into one category in that, but I think the biggest thing for us was like not having to maintain two code bases, right? Using our existing Solidity code. And then the way that Optimism's been approaching like their OVM is they're trying to leverage as much as possible from like the EVM and like what exists and what's super secure today. And so, you know, for example, I think their like compilers like a 200-line diff or something like that, right? So those were all considerations we were taking into account. And then I think we just really like their team, and we're really excited about working with them. At the same time, we're trying to we want to be at the bleeding edge. And so I think one question we've been getting a lot is like, what's our overall L2 strategy, right? So we love the Optimism team. We love what they're doing. I think as things, continue to change, we're certainly excited about just being on L2 in general and making sure that we're at the forefront of the way the community is moving. And then again, it's just a lot of it's social too, right? Where is the liquidity going to be is something we've been thinking a lot and trying to figure out. And so, to me, all those things kind of went into our initial, our main decision. And then, yeah, obviously risk mitigation and this type of stuff is an important factor as well. But I think the other stuff, maybe even, not to say it was this isn't important or anything. It seems like those other things were kind of the things that were dictating, our decision.
Nice. Thank you very much, David and Stanley and Barry. I think that at this point we're quite over time, so I think we can wrap it up here. Thank you very much, everyone, Tina, Kartik, and the rest, and we'll see you around.
Yeah, thank you, Georgios. Thank you, everyone on this panel. And any, I guess, summary and next step for open questions from Justin or and Phil, Kartik, anyone who's on this call, as we are planning our next MEV roast, a mega event that will focus a lot more on these kind of microstructure questions, and also things that we touched on but didn't dive into, such as fairness debate, extraction versus mitigation. We will do a more systematic deep dive into those, but want to see if there's any remaining open questions that anyone wants to suggest as well, or takeaways. Justin, our roast master.
I don't have any specific questions. I mean, I'm glad I've been learning about flashbots for the last week or two, and I'm sure I'll have more questions as I do a more deep dive. But in general, I'd say that I'm very impressed with some of the principles that Flashbot has taken, around decentralization, around ethics, around open sourcing, around all this good stuff, eliminating the forest, etc. I still think there's a lot of work on the actual product, but I think the cultural foundations are extremely strong, which is fantastic.
Thank you.
Awesome. Well, I want to thank, as we wrap this up, I want to thank Justin for being our roast master, and Tina for coordinating this event, and the Flashbots team for just making sure that all these amazing conversations happen today. So I personally got to learn a lot of new things and a lot of interesting topics, and it seems like just from the conversation today, there's already enough content for what comes up for the next roast in June. So hopefully everybody on the chat and on the panel also got to participate in a lot of interesting discussions and got some new insights out of this. So I want to thank everybody here, from our panelists to everybody who watched, all 100 plus of you, and just everybody who participated and engaged with all of our speakers. So in terms of just kind of wrapping this up, thank you so much again, all of our speakers. And I have a quick announcement before we kind of close everything off today. We talked about the next roast is going to be in June. The next roast is going to be part of our DeFi specific themed event, Hack Money, which we're super happy to announce now. We kicked off all of ETH Global online events with Hack Money last year, and which is kind of what's happening in the world of MEV with Layer 2 and just all the excitement we've seen in DeFi since last summer. We're super excited to kind of go all in on DeFi again, and we're going to be running the second version of Hack Money next in 6 weeks. So this will be a 1,000-person event. It's probably going to be the biggest one we're going to be doing as ETH Global, and hopefully we'll have a lot more topics to dig into from a research and application standpoint. So thank you everybody who joined in today, and we'll see you all in a few weeks with the Scaling Ethereum finale, as well as in next month with Hack Money. So thanks again, everybody, and I hope you have a great rest of your week. In the meantime, enjoy some lo-fi beats as we wrap up the live stream.